Good morning and welcome to this session on housing systems and structural change. Great to see so many of you here. A few of our presenters, me included, were slightly worried that given it was the dinner last night, this might be an empty hall. So thank you for all turning up, and thank you for turning up on time, and welcome also to all of those who are joining us online virtually. My name's Peter Mayers. I'm an independent writer and researcher on housing and other public policy issues. You can read my work in Inside Story magazine, and in fact I'm working on a story based on the conference right now, hopefully have that up by the end of the week. It's my pleasure to facilitate this conversation with our three speakers, Nicola Foxworthy from Imagine Housing, Jennifer Michelmore from Studio THI, and Amy Hains from Homelessness New South Wales. And I'll introduce them to you in just a bit and in more detail as they come to speak. But on behalf of all our speakers this morning, let me acknowledge that here in Meanjin we meet on the country of the Jagera and Turrbal peoples. I pay my respects to Jagera and Turrbal elders, past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the audience, both here in the venue and online. And I note that these lands, like other lands around Australia, were never ceded. And I echo the aspirations of the Uluru Statement from the Heart that one day, hopefully not too far away, with voice, treaty and truth-telling, this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. I'd also make the point brought home to us in the session after lunch yesterday that statistically Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are far more likely to be at the sharp end of our housing crisis than other Australians, experiencing higher rates of housing stress, insecurity, overcrowding and homelessness. Our topic of housing systems and structural change is particularly relevant at this moment, as governments at all levels in Australia show renewed commitment to better and fairer housing outcomes, and we're seeing the biggest investment in social housing in decades. A belated but coordinated push for tenancy reform in private rental markets and a national housing accord to build 1.2 million new dwellings in 5 years. What's more, the Australian Government is asking us to contribute to the development of a national plan that promises to set out a shared vision to inform housing and homelessness policy for the next 10 years. This is a welcome and long overdue initiative. 6 years ago, in 2017, I attended the National Housing Conference in Sydney, and the article I wrote for Inside Story after attending that conference was titled "In Search of a National Housing Strategy." The conference had heard from keynote speaker Evan Siddle, President and CEO of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, who told us about Prime Minister Justin Trudeau launching Canada's National Housing Strategy with a declaration that housing rights are human rights and a promise to enshrine the right to adequate housing in Canadian law, plus billions of dollars in funding. So it's encouraging that Australia is now moving down a similar path. But at the risk of sounding churlish, I admit that I'm underwhelmed by the direction of travel. The issues paper that is meant to inform consultations on the national plan is a thin and disappointing document. To give you just one example of why I think that, the issues paper makes almost no mention of tax, even though, as Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz pointed out in the opening session of the conference, tax settings profoundly shape our housing system. On day one of the conference, Housing Minister Julie Collins listed all the things that the Albanese Labor government is doing on the housing front, and it was a long and impressive list. It's truly heartening to have the federal government back in housing in a major way. But when it came to the development of the national plan, I thought the minister could have been more ambitious. She said her goal was to set out a clearer strategy for how all levels of government can work together and with the private and community sectors to better support people facing housing challenges. Now, that would be very welcome indeed, but I would hope that a national housing plan would go well beyond a national vision to support those in need. I'd aspire to a national plan that puts housing in a larger context, drawing links, for example, between housing and the future shape of our cities and towns, housing and productivity, housing and labour market mobility, housing and retirement incomes, housing and climate change, housing and immigration policy, housing and inequality. And in this regard, I commend to you the Ahuri work led by Dr. Chris Martin at the City Futures Centre at UNSW, and the report they published earlier in June this year called Towards an Australian Housing and Homelessness Strategy, and we might hear more about that, I think, during the presentations. So in this session, we'll be asking whether recent welcome initiatives on housing go to the heart of the problem, or if we need other system-level changes to make Australia's housing system fairer, to respond to climate change, to increase the sustainability and productivity of Australia's built form. Our format is as follows. Each speaker will give a 15-minute presentation, and then they'll join me on stage for a moderated discussion, and of course, we'll open that up to your comments and questions as conference delegates. And I encourage those of you joining us online to please submit your questions using the app so that I can ask them on your behalf. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Nicola Foxworthy is Founding Director of the affordable housing consultancy Imagine Housing. Nicola previously held executive roles with the community housing sector and the Victorian Public Service. She has more than 20 years of industry experience and a deep understanding of the policy, regulatory, funding and commercial environment. Her talk is called Waking from the Great Australian Dream, Understanding Australian Housing System Outcomes. Please welcome Nicola.
Thanks, Peter. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on and pay my respects to elders past and present. Waking from the Great Australian Dream. I think we've spent all week talking about housing crisis and what's going on in our housing system. The evidence of that crisis is all around us. It is more and more discussed. It's now a mainstream discussion, I guess, which is new. For someone who spent a long time in this sector, that's a new thing. But I've been really surprised that the discussion around the level of crisis that we're in and discussion of reform of our systems have not really focused on what we want out of that reform, how we might articulate the desired outcomes we want from our housing system, and how we might use that to build community understanding, to inform effective interventions and to measure progress. So this presentation represents effectively some early thinking about how we might engage in that conversation a bit better and what would help us think through that. I would like to acknowledge also Marcus Spiller from SGS Economics and Planning, who actually helped me with some of the early thinking when we started this work. So I'm drawing a distinction between outputs and outcomes, and for the purpose of this discussion, I'm actually drawing a distinction between housing outcomes, the built form, the boxes, and housing system outcomes. I think there's a bit of a distinction there to bear in mind as we go through. The vast majority of the discussion we see, particularly in the public discourse, it might be slightly different in the academic and the sort of sector discourse, but in the public discourse, very much around outputs rather than outcomes. So we have lots of discussion about home ownership rates, about what it costs to rent a place, what it costs to buy a place, how much government spends on CRA. In those discussions and discussions of issues, housing issues, there's sort of an underlying premise in there that increasing home ownership rates will somehow fix this crisis we're in. And that focus and the absence of a focus about the outcomes we're actually after, I think often leads to a discussion about the different elements of the housing system, the outputs of the housing system, but in isolation and often without a sort of critical discussion about what might be good or bad in changes to those elements. So is a reduction in home ownership rates a bad thing? Why is it a bad thing? What did we want it to do that tells us it's a bad thing? I think from my perspective, effective reform actually understands a quite deep understanding of the impact of those changes in the housing system. What do they mean? How do they change the way that people experience their life? How do they change the economy? How do they change those wider things? And I think if we don't have a clear articulation of the outcomes that we're actually after, it's really hard to evaluate whether any action we take is achieving what we want it to achieve, because we weren't clear about what we wanted to achieve in the first place. So my thinking kind of took me to trying to unpack a little bit further, what are the range of things that our housing system impacts on? We've spent a lot of this week talking about that very first one, housing availability. Who has a house? Who can get a house? What does that look like? Who can't get a house? Why not? We've had some discussion also around housing stability. What does that mean to be able to be stable in whatever tenancy or tenure that you have? But there are a wide range of other impacts that our housing system has, and we've had less discussion about that, and I think that the public version of that discussion, much less discussion about that. What does housing mean for built form, for public realm quality? I think in the way that I've conceived of it, I've kind of put understanding of climate change, adaptation, mitigation into that built form quality thing. There will be other ways to conceive of those things, but that's where I've plugged it. Housing has a massive impact on functional communities. How does housing interact with the way that a community works? How does housing impact and is impacted by the finance system, investment, local economies, regional economies? And how does housing impact the fiscal arrangements that we have? What does it cost governments to maintain our current housing system? The other thing that became obvious to me is that those impacts, that's a much wider range of impacts that people that often don't talk about, but those impacts actually impact quite differently at different scales. So the impact that any one of those, what I've called domains, impacts at a household level is quite different to how it impacts at a neighbourhood or a regional or a national level. And for me, the thinness of our current discussion is problematic because we're not drawing out what those things need to look like. The other thing that as I teased it out, I kind of went, oh, we're talking about a system. You can't move one bit of a system without impacting a different part of that system. So if you haven't thought about the wider set of impacts and where those interchanges happen, then you're unlikely to have worked out what kind of both positive or negative impacts you'll have by changing one bit. What happens somewhere else? How do you think that through? So I think we come at this housing system idea as with a starting point. I think often, certainly the public discourse accepts that great Australian dream as a natural starting point for Australia's housing system and accepts that that's actually what we're aspiring to. I think if we have a little look at what our current housing system is doing and using that, the kind of framework that I'm proposing, then I've plucked out a couple of examples of what's going on in our current housing system. Clearly, given the conversations we've had all week, there are many, many others. I'm not suggesting they're not. I'm just suggesting that here's a couple that we can start our discussion with today, I think. That at a housing level, we clearly have a large and growing number of households who are having difficulty in housing affordability at the household level. They cannot find the housing they need that is the right fit for their circumstance, their family composition and their housing needs. At a regional level, we have an increasing issue that local businesses can't find the employees they need, largely because new employees can't find housing in those areas, can't stay in those areas. At a national level, we have a sort of underlying question about the kind of investment that's going on in our wider economies, in productive investment. We have a lot of money that's tied up in unproductive housing that's already built and is just swirling around the exact same system, and that actually removes money from potential for more productive investment in other things. So I think a critical examination of our current housing system might suggest that that great Australian dream may not be performing quite so well these days. So what might a wider consideration look like? I think it's worth me highlighting that for the purpose of this discussion, I have definitely plugged in some potential outcomes. I'm not actually here saying I think these are the right outcomes. I am here saying I think we need some kind of framework like this to help us think about what they should be. In fact, the fleshing out of what those outcomes ought to be, I think, will absolutely need sector engagement and engagement with government. It's not going to have any power unless it has those things. But for the moment, I think I'll just kind of pluck out a couple and demonstrate how I think it might work, or the idea that I'm testing, I guess. So we definitely, from an outcomes point of view, I think most people in this room, you could start at that top corner at a household level for housing availability. Well, I think we'd all kind of agree that stable housing for the composition and life stage of that household is probably a positive outcome, something that we'd all want. I think teasing out the idea of how this might work, thinking through how those, both the domains and the scales interact. For example, if we go to what does stable housing mean at a regional level, ideally would mean that it's delivering as an outcome improved education and health and justice outcomes for that region. In a built form realm, we actually at a national level might want energy reduction from our housing system. For our functional communities at a neighbourhood level, we want viable local shops, we want services and things that can actually run properly. If we shift into domains that are kind of more economic, if you like, that's probably a better way to describe it. From a finance system, we actually want households with less debt, maybe. We definitely want decreased wealth inequality. Well, at least I do. That would be my view. And I guess that's the point of the exercise. It sparks those discussions. Do we want that? And if we want that, who needs to do what about that? So that's the thinking that I'm trying to put forward. I think it is reassuring to see, and particularly in the context of the development of the new national housing strategy, that there is some emerging approaches that are starting to step into that much wider frame. And I think the Uhuru report, Chris Martin's Uhuru report that Peter referred to earlier, actually takes a pretty big leap into the conversation about what do we want. It starts with, actually, we need ambition, and from that paper's point of view, a primary mission and some secondary missions. That primary mission is actually a pretty bold statement in Australia at the moment, I think. Everybody should have adequate housing as a mission statement. And the secondary missions that flesh out, I guess, that wider sense of how housing impacts a range of things is kind of reflected here. Definitely moves from just thinking about individual households and how they get housed to how that impacts a wider set of things, and particularly that last one around economic performance. I think the other thing that I'd like to highlight is in that paper, Chris Martin fleshes out the point of having a mission is actually because it points government whose role it is to set the framework. So our housing system is not natural or innate in any way. It's the product of actions of governments over a very long time and other stakeholders, but governments have a very particular role in setting that framework. So I think laying out that mission in that way is a way of focusing government's role in shaping a system so that it delivers the outcomes we want. And from my perspective, that would say pretty clearly you need to know what you want if you're going to work out how to shape it. I have borrowed shamelessly from the paper, so this is directly lifted from the towards the National Housing Strategy paper. I think it's useful because it fleshes out where the policy levers sit that influence all of those domains. If you start at that bottom left corner, it's the stuff that we're all really familiar with. It's policy that directly affects social housing, homelessness, those sorts of things. But moving upwards and to the right is kind of instructive in the wide range of things that potentially need to be coordinated if you're going to shape a housing system, and ideally shape it in the direction that you've decided you want it to go. Pretty hard to shape it if you haven't worked out where you're going. And that does include those really big picture things, macroeconomic policy, taxation, immigration, so that it takes you to that wide sense. The other thing I did, this slide, I nearly didn't put it in because it looks so messy, and then I thought, no, that's exactly my point. What I've done is just try and highlight who owns those levers. And in this slide, only in government who owns those levers. There are clearly a bunch of other institutions and players and stakeholders, but for this purpose, it's enough just to say that there's local, there's state, there's Commonwealth. And I think what it does is highlight that any of those actions actually involve a huge range of players, and they're very complex actions and a huge range of integration needed. And again, if it's not clear, if we don't have a clear common purpose, how could you possibly integrate against all of those things and get to a housing system that you've actually chosen and built? So it's really just a high-level reminder that there is real value in the clarity to be able to enable all of those actors to line up underneath and align what they're doing. So, from my point of view, what would a framework change? I think it'd give you a tool to test stuff. It would give you a tool to work out whether what we're actually doing is delivering positive outcomes against the thing we decided we wanted, as opposed to some accident that just happens to be occurring. I think it would help us build better discourse. It would help journalism. It would help, it would be harder to talk about that sort of isolated outputs rather than the outcomes, because there's a more common understanding of the importance of that outcome that we're all after. I think it would be harder for politicians to do stuff that don't really work, so they'd have to actually justify it against an outcome. I think it'd give you a framework to hang targets off, easier to critique things that aren't working particularly well, and easier to make compelling arguments for more complicated actions. So that's my hope anyway. If you were going to do this, where would you go next? I think there is obviously an opportunity to test, are the domains right? Are the scales right? Are those outcomes right? What kind of conversation do we need to be able to build a shared version of what that might be, and who cares about which bit and why? And I think if you got that far, you could also then engage in some development of monitoring and evaluation tools to test what is actually happening. Are we moving closer to those outcomes we said we want, or are we not? So, in conclusion, I reckon adopting an outcomes framework would actually give you a way forward for a much richer conversation about the housing system that we actually want and what we're trying to deliver with it at its biggest scale, like right through, not just for the individual households, although that's incredibly important, but for the way that our communities and our economies work. I'm really interested to hear what other people think about that, so I'd love to hear that in your questions and in further dialogue. And thanks for letting me share my fledgling idea.
Thanks so much, Nicola. That's really a compelling argument. I hope you're going to write that up and put it in as a submission to the national consultations on the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. Yeah, and I saw people taking photos of the slides. Remember, the slides will be made available, maybe not straight away, but as soon as Ahuri can through the conference portal. And I'm sure Nicola will be happy to, I'm speaking on behalf here, Nicola, but to share them with you, so have a chat to her. So if we're going to achieve transformational change and the kind of changes we've been talking about throughout the conference and indeed here at this session, then, we've talked about things like addressing the missing middle to develop high quality, medium density housing, including social housing in established suburbs. That's a huge challenge. If we're going to do that, we need community support, community buy-in, rather than fear and negativity and distrust. So our second speaker is going to address that challenge, among others. Jennifer Michelmore is the CEO at Studio THI, a not-for-profit organisation creating a portfolio of tools, resources and training programs to help communities and practitioners better navigate urban change. She's a systems thinker and an urbanist collaborating with a global network of people who live in, lead, plan for, design and develop cities to maximise the social benefits of urban change. And she's been doing this work for a couple of decades. Jennifer.
Excellent. Sorry, those lights are right in my eyes. So I'm just going to come to the side a little bit. So thank you, everyone, for the introduction. And Nicola, I think your fantastic context setting of the bigger picture system, and from our work, we're zooming right in, I suppose, to some of those outcomes we started to talk about. So in all of the discussions, as Peter really lovely put the front end context here, to achieve some of these big picture challenges and opportunities that have been constantly discussed over the last couple of days, we need to get an additional 10 million people in Australia in the next sort of 20 years. Susie Lloyd-Hurwitz pointed out we have to have 1.2 million homes built in the next 5 years in well-serviced, well-located locations, predominantly through things like getting missing middle, densification in those established suburbs. And all those things are actually going to require significant urban change to our cities. So to be more climate responsive, to have more social quality and housing, and all these other components we have to do, the look, feel and experience of our cities will change. And one of the big parts of that, we started to look at, well, as a system, how do we actually start that happening? So when we sort of talk about the urban system, and I keep forgetting, I need to actually put the federal government back into this diagram because they are now part of the discussion. We're sorry for anyone in the federal government who may be here, but you can see when we started talking about this, I actually didn't have federal in this discussion because in our work, they really weren't part of the conversation. I do need to remember to put them back in. So they are in, which is fantastic. But it takes the community. So basically, as a system, we have community, elected officials, local government, state government, developers, capital advisors. A lot of your CHPs really are now developers and people running housing, providing housing. We have peak bodies like PIA, Huri, all the other kind of people that are there, professional advisors. And as a system, we all need to be able to collectively champion step change urban ambitions. So we need to be able to say, these are the types of things our cities need, and this is why they're really important. We then have to help navigate that change in our cities. So it's not going to be easy. It is a change. There's going to be challenges to that change, and we have to be able to navigate those changes together. And when we do it, we have to have that vision of where we're trying to go and where are we trying to get to for the future and future generations of our city. And from our organisation's perspective, we really started to ask, well, is this system change ready? Do we have the knowledge, insight, capabilities to actually do that task that's ahead of us? So in terms of the work that I'm going to talk to today, obviously there's many players and many actors and many people doing different things in that particular system. And it's going to take all of us doing lots of different things to kind of shift the dial. And the particular piece of work that my organisation focuses on is actually starting to look at how do we actually bring communities along on this change journey and also elected officials, because in all our research we've been hearing elected officials are the community's most trusted advisor on urban change. So how do we actually think about fostering the community's understanding, knowledge, and ultimately support for quality growth, housing diversity, and how all those things are really critical to the social and sustainability of our cities. So that's the kind of focus that our work is focusing on at the moment. And what we started to look at is, well, how do we know where communities are at? Do they have any understanding of the need for that? Actually, do they know that we're growing? Do they know that we need to grow in a different way, that we need more consolidation and all these other components that as practitioners, we all take for granted that people understand? But if we looked at the disciplines of change management and thought about how could we take a change management approach to working with communities, would we approach this task differently? So we've drawn on ADCAR model. I'm sure, hands up everyone who's been in large organisational change processes. I'm sure you've probably seen some version of the ADCAR model provided to you. But what we started to think about is thinking, how do we unpack that approach and take a change management approach to bringing communities and other people along on this change journey? So we started to look at what is the community's level of awareness and understanding of the fact that we're growing and why. Do they have ownership and understanding of the need for urban consolidation, increased density and housing diversity? Do we just assume that people understand that there's all these needs and requirements? Do they have knowledge of the challenges and benefits of these changes and what great outcomes could be like, and then therefore are advocating for the type of a great we're all looking for? And then once we have awareness, ownership, knowledge, we then have the ability to actually be part of some of these really tricky conversations, which could be about tax reform. But if we don't actually have awareness, ownership of the challenge and knowledge of how we can actually start addressing that challenge, having those robust conversations can be quite difficult. So how do we actually think about building this discussion from a city-wide point of view, but also in project-specific or discussion topic area specific? So one of the first starting points is, what is your gap? Where is your community starting point? Where are they starting from? And when we looked at a lot of research around the world, we could not see anything that actually took an evidence-based approach to understanding a community's change readiness for urban change and what their knowledge, understanding and awareness is. So we piloted something called an Urban Change Readiness Index. The QR code up there takes you to a pilot process we've ran with 4 local government areas across Australia, and I'll just, these 4 local government areas, Hume, Ballarat, Cairns and Penrith. Sorry, I just flicked back because it's gone the wrong way. And our index actually looks at people's level of urban change literacy. So that's their awareness, knowledge, progression we were talking about before. What is their level of literacy about the urban changes we need? What's their level of current place attachment? And this future vision we might be talking about, how different is that for them? Is it a step too far? Is it something that's actually going to cause a lot of hurt, pain and anger, which is okay, but we have to work through acknowledging what that is. And then what is their level of trust in the system? And from a research point of view, we do gather data through a 30-minute online survey. We recruit and incentivise between 150 and 300 people that reflect a local community's demographic, and that includes young people, includes renters. Often they don't have formal voices in planning processes because they're not ratepayers. So renters are a key audience there. Women renting over 55, so a lot of these more vulnerable audiences, we make sure we hear their views in this research, because often in public notification periods for major change projects, they're a missing voice, they're not included in the discussion. So we make sure we hear from a wide-ranging part of people talking about change and actually understanding each of those elements. We then can create an index outcome, which I can take you through that in more detail, but what I thought would be more worthwhile today is actually taking you through some of the insights we found out about how change-ready communities are for major transformational urban change, and what that actually starts meaning we have to be doing maybe different in our practice. So firstly, what you can see on the screen there is we presented to people in the survey how much their city was growing by and changing, and asked them, were you aware of that? Now, I suppose you can see on the screen there, starting point of no awareness that their city was growing. So if you are not aware that your city is growing, you're starting to see more densification of your cities, you're being spoken to about the need for social and affordable housing, and you actually just don't even understand the size and scale of change coming in the city. It's actually very hard to endorse or support some of those kinds of outcomes. So fundamentally, one of the biggest takeaways is keep talking to your communities about how much you are actually growing by, the number you're growing by, and some of those challenges you're going to have to address, because the current awareness is so low. We then immediately ask people how they're feeling about that change. And obviously, if you've never heard about the fact that you're growing, anxious is actually probably a fairly okay response, because you've never actually heard that your city is growing. Equally though, people are excited and confident about the change that's coming. So actually, a lot of people, when we've presented this data to them, the elected officials particularly, feel they thought it would have been the complete opposite to that they would have had much stronger representation of people who feel angry or fearful about the change. So actually, when we start to unpack that, people are actually feeling anxious, but also excited and confident about what's coming. We talk to people about whole of community benefits, so who is benefiting from this process? And as you can see, a lot of people actually could say that I have personally benefited from urban changes happening in our city. Some negatively affected, but not as much as you would think. So most people can actually talk to individual and all of community benefits from the changes that have been happening in their cities over time, and could quite clearly talk about those benefits that were happening in their cities. One of the challenging things that we've found is that, remember, that next sort of level up is their knowledge and ownership of the need for consolidation. And as you can see on this screen here, most people just felt continually to build in greenfield developments on the edge of cities is the way we should be accommodating growth in our cities. So as that mandate for change, the mandate for urban consolidation, it is not in the communities yet. So whenever we can, starting to talk about all the needs, desires, and the really great things about a more consolidated approach and what that means for our cities long term is a really big shift we're going to have to be focused on as a sector. The other thing that they actually did like, once they knew about them, were all the great strategies that planners, so up on that regional planning, every city talks about a 15-minute city, although there's a lot of controversy around that at the moment, but people do actually understand that concept once you start explaining it to them. Their housing diversity strategies, we introduced them to the communities. We asked them if they knew about them at all, so you can see there, over 50% of people had never heard about most of these strategies of how their city is growing. Once they had heard about them, though, they actually saw that they were very important and attractive to how their city was growing. But before that, they didn't actually have any understanding of those as strategies. So if we're out there talking to communities about the value of housing diversity and choice, they don't even actually know that that's something we need or what we're trying to achieve. So just being really conscious of how we start building that in our thinking is a really important takeaway from our point of view. On the last, so what we did talk to communities about is we give them a number of change scenarios in their city, and we make the change scenarios specific to the ones that are happening within their local government area. This outcome you're looking at on the screen was the most high density scenario. That also included the allocation of at least 15% social and affordable housing. So we started to put those types of change contexts into our more dense housing outcomes. And as you can see, we asked them would they like that in their local area, in their sort of own neighbourhood? Could they imagine that scenario? And then could they imagine that scenario somewhere else across their local government area? So a bit of the not in my backyard, but in my backyard, how would you feel about that change? And what you can see there is that although some people are saying that's unthinkable, but if you add together the desirable, comfortable, and they would go, it's sensible but challenge, it makes sense. It's a bit hard. That means my community's going to have to change. My neighbourhood would change, but I feel comfortable with what you're starting to kind of direction you're going in. People actually are on board with some of these scenarios once we start explaining the outcomes to them. So the last kind of key finding, I suppose, from across all these 4 cities is that across that whole system we talked about, local government leadership is where the trust sits. So local government leadership being local government staff, so your actual staff, but also elected officials. Councillors came up time and time again as the community's most trusted voice on urban change. When we've done the survey, the other part of the survey we do is with staff and elected officials where we can in those cities as well. And 47% of the staff and councillors told us they didn't feel equipped to lead conversations with community about quality urban change, that they didn't feel equipped to build awareness, knowledge, and all those kinds of discussions we had before. So it's this really interesting kind of tension point starting to emerge where they are the people the community is going to speak to. So how do we actually upskill them in their capability to do it? So when we started to kind of look at where we're at now, so you remember we had the awareness, knowledge, little kind of stepping ladder, and we've just kind of put that in a ladder. At the bottom, you can see today is where we're at. So basically, there's really limited awareness of change at all across the board. There might be bits and pieces, but overall, we're really starting quite down here. We are needing to be much clearer with our ambition or where we're trying to head from an urban consolidation, densification of our city point of view when we talk to communities, so we actually know where we're going. But what we're trying to do is how do we build that awareness of change, understanding that mandate for change, understand the challenges and opportunities of that coming, so actually be much more considered in that change approach of how we're actually having conversations with communities as we grow. And one of the key things we found in our survey when we did it was that through education, it shifts sentiment. So it shifts people's feeling towards that change when you educate them about the strategies you're trying to do, why it's important. And so how do you actually scale that up to do that in your practice? And final slide here is then, this is now what we're doing with Cairns Regional Council. So they found that their community had no idea they were growing. They're needing to accommodate at least 75,000 more people in Cairns without any other greenfield development. They're having to do a lot more infill and consolidation, particularly in response to their climate hazard and adaptation challenges they're going to have in Cairns. So their challenge coming is significant. So what we've been working with them on is to actually help build an education resource set that actually starts with why is Cairns growing? And it's a 30-second hand-drawn video about why Cairns is growing. The next one is why Cairns needs to have more homes in established areas. Really fundamental things. Seems like it's a very basic kind of messaging to be getting out, but that's the very purposefully build that foundation knowledge to make sure we can actually then have a community that have all those kind of awareness, knowledge and understanding. So then when we come to talking about scenarios of what's actually going to happen in their neighbourhoods, there's a foundation of knowledge and education there as well. So sort of the end of my presentation is imagine you had a local community who were supportive, and a councillor. I'll put in a local councillor as well, which makes it even trickier. Imagine you had a local community who were supportive of quality growth, urban consolidation and housing diversity. What could be possible? And how do we get to that point to actually really proactively try and build our community's capability where we know we're needing to do really tricky social and affordable mixed tenure housing developments at density? How do we actually think about it in a pre-preparedness phase of that community, so when we come to talking to them about some of the types of step change outcomes we're trying to achieve, they're much more ready for that discussion with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. I mean, what fascinating research, and it's really actually an incredibly optimistic message that you seem to be telling us there. Firstly, that level of trust in local government and the capacity for people to change their views when given the right sorts of informations and conversations. So our third speaker is going to go to homelessness and a systems approach to homelessness. Amy Hains is the acting CEO of Homelessness New South Wales. In her recent role as Deputy CEO, she led the peak body's work on systems change, policy research and advocacy, and she's previously had a 20-year career in the New South Wales public health system, holding executive roles in strategy, hospital planning and analytics. And her presentation, as I said, is on systems thinking to end homelessness together. Please welcome Amy.
Good morning, everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge the Jagera people and the Turrbal people whose lands we're meeting on today, and I'd like to pay my deep respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal people in the room today. I'd also want to pause and acknowledge people with lived expertise and thank the people who have contributed to the work that I'm going to talk about today, and also acknowledge people in the room with lived experience. So a tiny bit about Homelessness New South Wales. We're the peak body for homelessness in New South Wales, and we exist to build the capability of people and the capacity of systems to end homelessness. And today I'm going to talk about something that we've been working on for more than 12 months now, a systems approach to ending homelessness. And we started this work with the Australian Centre for Social Innovation some time ago, and we've taken it forward with our sector from there. And after hearing Nicola and Jennifer talk about the kinds of communities that we want to create and the outcomes we want to see, I think what I'm going to talk about is going to add a slightly different but complementary angle to that. So our starting point in this work was to bring people together around a common definition of the problem we're trying to solve. And we found through our conversations with people that there are many different perspectives on this, of course, and unsurprisingly, people often framed it through their own experience. And the problem statement we ended up with speaks to the mindset that we think the system needs to have, and that is that homelessness is solvable. So that when we have anyone experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, we should see that as a problem, as much of a problem as when we don't have a road or we don't have a hospital. And what we set out to do was to work with many partners to co-create a system approach to ending homelessness in New South Wales. And that's about having a shared goal and a shared understanding of how we can all work in our individual areas in an aligned way. We published a report a couple of months ago to mark the first iteration of this work, and it's continuing from there. And at the end of my presentation, I'll provide a barcode so that you can download that if you'd like to read more. But today I want to give you a flavour of the systems change approach, and by that I mean the language, the ways we can unpack our system and see it in new ways, how we can see ourselves in our system and what role we're currently playing, and where we can act to make a difference. And I want to pause for a moment and talk about the value of thinking of the homelessness system as distinct from the housing system, because we've heard a lot about housing this week. This is obviously a housing conference, and clearly housing is an enormous part of the homelessness system, but the housing crisis is not the only contributor to homelessness. And we can see that by the groups of people in our society who have historically been and continue to be at highest risk of homelessness. There are a lot of other forces at play, which means that there are a lot of angles we need to work from to end homelessness. So I'm going to spend a moment describing what a system is and how we apply that to homelessness. So most of us are familiar with systems in the natural world, river systems, rainforests, ocean ecosystems. But homelessness is a system too, made up of people, organisations, government policies, market forces, incentives, and much more. It's complex, and it's made more difficult to understand and change by the fact that we're all like the fish in this picture swimming in this system. The norms of the system are just natural to us. They're just the way things are. And in many ways, we can't even see them. A fish doesn't know it's in the water. So the first step for us in trying to change the homelessness system is to examine and understand the water we're swimming in. So part of this work is trying to help all of us better understand the system and really see what's going on below the surface to hold the long-standing problems of homelessness in place. And then the systems change approach is to work out how to shift those conditions and to be able to harness and align the efforts of many players in the system towards the common goal. And a very important part of systems change is that everyone plays a role. To help us understand the system, we spoke to many people, over 650 people from many organisations, and many lived experts were involved in the work, as I said. Starting with the service system, lived experts, but then stepping further out, players whose core purpose in their work wasn't to work on homelessness, but whose efforts in peripheral ways could have major impacts on homelessness. So big developers, real estate, academics, philanthropy, mainstream services that intersect with homelessness. And it's all about building a commitment to a shared vision so that the many actors can pull the levers that are available to them. And now I want to just briefly describe to you the picture of the homelessness system that all of those conversations helped us create. We distilled all of the conversations down to 4 key challenges in the system. And if we think about a river, the system challenges are like big grey boulders that block the passage of people trying to navigate down the river and out of homelessness. And then in red, we have the system conditions that are like vices holding the boulders in place. Some of those conditions are overtly visible to us, things like the system rules, the policies, the practices that govern access to government services, for example. And still on those conditions, we have relationships and power dynamics, and this is about the connections and relationships that do or don't exist in the system and how they either maintain the status quo or create tension and competition. And commissioning and contracting structures play a big role in shaping that. And power dynamics are so important in driving the behaviour of the system. This is where things like systemic bias and racism come into play. And then the least tangible conditions are mental models. These are the deeply held assumptions or taken for granted ways of operating. And to understand the mindsets in our homelessness system, we can ask questions like, what is the level of homelessness that we accept in our system? Who is to blame for homelessness? How much will we pay in order to end homelessness? And how much is too much? These are difficult questions, but we can learn a lot about our system when we go to this level. And we've heard a lot of these themes coming through this week. To briefly describe the challenges, social and economic policy creating increasing numbers of people becoming homeless. So we're saying here there are a range of policy settings that have been talked about today and this week. At a macro level, social security payment levels, tax policy, incentivising property investment, lack of investment in early intervention, which is a systemic problem across many sectors. That creates a steady stream of people falling into homelessness. Lack of coordination across government and services to deliver support. And this is about mass failures like coordination of exits from institutions like hospitals, prisons, out-of-home care. We know these are big sources of people coming into homelessness, but we have not solved that problem as yet. And there are systemic barriers to accessing accommodation and support. So overwhelmingly, people with lived experience described a system that's restrictive, complex and exhausting to navigate. There are a myriad of rules and criteria, and they're set predominantly by government and service providers. And then there are the slightly less tangible but very significant forces at play like racism, other discrimination, stigma that systematically put some people at higher risk of becoming homeless and then make it more difficult for them to access the kinds of assistance that they need to exit. And lastly, people's support needs are not being met. And this is the result of all the challenges I just mentioned, plus the systemic lack of supply of social and affordable housing. But despite all of this, there are people who navigate down the river and out of homelessness. They're the people who are experiencing homelessness with extraordinary resilience. They're the people who work in services and who help people out of homelessness. And there is great innovation happening in the system. and great resilience in the middle of this housing crisis. And these are definitely things to celebrate. But what would it take if we actually wanted to remove the challenges rather than just circumvent them? Where do we start in a complex system? We had a lot of conversations about what the biggest leverage points are for action in the system, and people identified them at all different levels. I mean, some of them we're talking about today, like community perceptions, that sort of thing. I want to just give you a very brief run through of our findings, and you can get this in the report as well. We want a system that makes homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. So rare, we want to prevent homelessness and intervene where people are at risk. Brief, we want to wrap support around people and provide accommodation to meet their needs. And non-recurring, we want to help people achieve long-term pathways out of homelessness. So here are the leverage points. I'm going to just focus on a couple of things today, and I suppose while we're in the consultation period for the national plan, this is where the focus is for today, I think. In the New South Wales system, like in most service systems, most of the resources are going into managing crisis situations and the crisis end of the system, and not into prevention. But we have a unique opportunity to lift our eyes and look at the startlingly clear evidence about preventing homelessness. And to prevent homelessness, we need to look at the upstream factors that cause it and coordinate those policy levers, like Peter said in his introduction, to reduce poverty, reduce domestic and family violence, childhood trauma. And I want to pause for a moment and acknowledge the importance of income. The single most impactful thing we could do to end homelessness and impact the vast majority of social and health problems would be to raise the level of income people receive. If we did this, we'd be lifting people out of poverty, and at the same time, we'd reduce the income disparity in our community, which is a major cause of issues. And as people would know, there's a strong social gradient at play in all the health and social problems in our society, particularly chronic disease, mental health, suicide rates, trauma, child protection issues. Poverty contributes to an unfathomable amount of suffering for communities, and it costs the budgets millions, billions, I should say. When we're talking about raising income levels, it's not a question about the evidence, because the evidence is in. It's a question about mindsets. So I'm not going to focus any more on any of these because I think I'm going to run out of time. I just will say, though, the major part of non-recurring, of course, and it's been the major subject of conversation this week, it's the housing system. Of course, we've acknowledged we need sustained investment in social and affordable housing, and we'll talk more today about leading countries having legislated the right to housing and support and set targets for social housing. And we need this kind of leadership from the Commonwealth in this national plan. We also need strong language around housing as a right and providing it for those who are most in need. But we also need to make sure that in going about building all the housing that we need, we're not perpetuating the same structural barriers for people most in need. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. I just want to make a tiny comment about measurement. There's so much to say here. This is a whole talk in itself, so I'm not going to go into it. I wanted to just point you, as part of our systems change work, we have pulled together a lot of predominantly publicly accessible data sources on housing, homelessness, the upstream factors causing homelessness, short-term rental accommodation, a raft of things, rent prices, rental vacancies, into a dashboard. It's got 9 pages, and all of the data reference sources are at the back of it. At the moment, it's a New South Wales resource, but most of the data sources are available nationally. So encourage you to have a look, and I think better joined up data is one of the key leverage points for being able to manage and understand our housing and homelessness system better, and transparency is a very key factor in providing better outcomes for people. And there's just one more component of the work that I want to share and talk about, and that's the principles. So we talked a lot with people in this work about the need to work differently, and it's been a couple of months since we released this report. And I have to say, on this work, our thinking is evolving all the time, just based on conversations we're having, and I think the sector's thinking is evolving all the time on this as well. The intent of the principles initially was to be like a set of shared ethics for how we work together to end homelessness. But I actually, on reflection, I think, and in the National Plan context, there are two very important ones that I want to talk about, and I would go further than to say it's a set of shared ethics. I think we cannot end homelessness if we don't do number 4 and number 2. So if we don't surface and address the systemic bias in our system, which is really the root of homelessness, if we don't do that, we will not end homelessness. Despite all of the housing we might develop, we will perpetuate the same systemic structural barriers for people. And shifting power to lived experience is along a similar vein. It's about sharing power and involving people who are using the systems who actually have the deepest expertise to be able to design and help run the systems that we provide. And I think it's all of our roles as leaders, as people who work in services, as academics, as advocates, to be able to better describe and understand and tell people about what the insidious tentacles of structural discrimination actually look like in practice. And we heard some really great, I've been really alive to this because it's obviously a theme we're working a lot in, but in all the sessions that I've attended, I've been very alert to examples of this. And I attended the session, I think it was on Tuesday, on Aboriginal home ownership, and there were some really good examples of structural bias, I suppose, that came up in that session. I'll just tell you about a couple of them just to sort of illustrate what I'm talking about, the nuance of this that we need to get better at understanding. And the reason we need to get better at it is because we need to go forward in a completely different way. So 39% of Australian landmass now is in the hands of traditional owners, I have found out this week, but there's been a lack of proper support and advice about economic development rights, so that some traditional owners find that their land now is effectively undevelopable. And someone else in that session talked about the colonial overhang of housing design in social housing and how it prevents living according to culture and how it even can shape undesirable cultural practice. And of course, the direct racism encountered in the private rental market by First Nations people and the gap in home ownership rates. They're some of the more, I suppose, the things that generally people are more awake to. But they're just a few examples of structural racism in our system. And in the plenary session on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing yesterday, the call to action really was about decision-making power shared with Aboriginal organisations and communities, and about partnerships based on equality. Equal partnership and shared power is the only way we are going to be able to see structural racism for what it is in our system and be able to shape a different future together. And it's a similar theme. I'm not going to talk any more about it. I don't have time. I would forever. But it's a similar theme you can see with lived experience as well. Okay, so there's the link to the report, and thank you very much, everyone. Over here.
Microphone. Okay, look, fantastic research, really great insights, and I want to come back to some of those, and I'm going to encourage your questions now. We have a bunch of questions on the app as well from those people online, but I'm going to invite our 3 speakers to come and join us up in the comfy chairs on stage, the Michael Parkinson set, and we'll... comfy chair. No, I'm not sure if they're comfy either, and we'll have some questions. We've got one extra. Okay, we have a question already in the room, so I'll start with you while Amy's coming up as well.
Amazing. I think kind of bringing together 2 of the things we've heard today, both about making sure that we see outcomes across all these different levels from households up to the broader system, and how we ensure that we're bringing communities along to kind of see change. I'd really like to know if we can and how we can involve and bring communities along at that higher system level, potentially on things like negative gearing, where we do see, I think, a barrier from, you know, potentially that lack of understanding and that lack of, yeah.
Who wants to tackle that one? How do we bring people along at that systems level of the bigger kind of...
It's probably me.
Yeah, it's probably you, Jen.
You start and then we'll go.
Yeah, look, I think part of the thinking that I'm doing is very much about trying to find the ways that help people understand that in its bigger context. So understanding the connection between negative gearing and a housing system outcome, but also having to come back and have a discussion about what was it that you wanted. So did you want massive inequality? Did you want a whole bunch of people who can't get housed? Did you want a housing system that can't respond to the needs? It's a pretty fundamental question, and I'm hopeful, maybe I'm horribly optimistic, but I'm hopeful that deeper discussions around those things actually do help people understand the connections in the way that they're not really being helped to understand at the moment, and that I think leads to a much richer discussion. I doubt that means that absolutely everybody would suddenly go, great, remove my negative gearing, but I think it changes the balance of the conversation, and it helps people understand that the system that they are in now, the water they're in now, you can change that. It's actually possible. It's not just something that is innate and you know, somehow there. It's actually stuff that we're creating. We control it, and the people you elect control it. So that's a starting point for the conversation.
Jen, I don't know if you want to pick up on that, but it seems to me that one of the challenges is between a kind of individualistic notion of housing as a wealth asset, as a private asset, and housing as a process of, or an element of building community. And your research seems to suggest that once people think about it from the community building perspective, then they have a more generous or more other-oriented approach.
Yeah, one of the slides I didn't include, which is a key part of our work and how we work with communities. So it's like content awareness, knowledge, understanding, but there's also a citizenship lens to the discussion. So what are my needs is sort of your first position. What are the needs of others who aren't like me? So how do we help community understand needs of others who are not like them? And then how do you understand the needs of future generations is sort of the third position. And in each of those discussions, how do you be very conscious on how you actually build a structured conversation around that in terms of, okay, this will affect you in this way. How might it affect someone who's different to you? Have you heard of their views? Go and find them or talk to them or introduce research that represents that other view. And then you think, well, this is what the impact of that will be in the next 20 years if we don't address that. What do we need to be thinking about now that might not impact, that is going to impact you today, but is going to make a better society? And it sounds an easy thing to do, but if you actually can be consciously quite structured in how you do that, I think it can really, it shifts the discussion that you're having with an individual as well, and what you're asking them to support, endorse, be conscious of, or help build a solution towards as well.
I think we also have to be wary of assuming that, or we have to distinguish between lobby campaigns against things like changes to negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount versus public opinion. They're not necessarily the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just take a quick question from the app. And this is a kind of critique, I think, of what we've been discussing, that we've had a predominantly kind of metro-centric mindset. And how can we shift from, when we talk about regional or remote areas as being different, what we really mean is they're more expensive, or it's more expensive to do things in them. How do we shift to that, to an idea of regional and remote areas as empowered? I don't know if, Amy?
Yeah. I mean, I can't comment on the cost of construction in different areas of the country, but I don't know is this working?
Yep.
Yes, okay. What I would say from a homelessness and capability perspective, regional and rural areas often are streets ahead when it comes to collaborative approaches and the relationships that exist and the lack of ego sometimes, the lack of turf wars at times. So I would say that when it comes to regional responses around, like in disaster, for example, or there are several really successful examples of services coming together to do a regional response to try and end street sleeping, for example, and they're going very, very well in regional areas on the whole. So I think that from a service provider's perspective, it's a different kind of perception, and I think there's a lot of admiration and community capacity and strength.
I think one of the other things in the sort of framework discussion that I've been putting forward, actually that comment probably is a commentary around, well, are the domains right? What are the scales? How would you build in those considerations so that they become explicit and you have to address what you want and where you want it and how that works in a bigger system sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly points to a legitimate critique. I mean, I know when I wrote my book about housing, I didn't talk about regional housing and road housing at all, and it's a big failure. So another question here. Yep.
Andrew.
Yep.
Andrea Sharon from RMIT. Great presentations, all of you. I have a question around economic literacy within government, industry and community in particular. But before asking something around that, an observation. Nicola, you gave a great presentation about how to make policy. And what I've observed actually in the last few weeks since the Commonwealth's issues paper come out is whereas we used to advocate what should be in a policy, we're now advocating how to make policy. And, you know, it's pretty dismal, isn't it, to try and teach a government how to do policy. I think one of the, yes, we need to have a proper policy making process, but we also need to, I think, look deeply into some of the dominant narratives that are informing the thinking, particularly of government, and is quite implicit, I think, within industry. And one of those narratives is around supply and the linkage between supply and affordability, where it is said, if we increase supply to meet demand, prices will come down. Now, it's totally faulty logic. It's assuming not merely a perfect market, but a commodity market, and housing is not a commodity. It's a highly heterogeneous asset. So it does not behave like a commodity market at all. And if, you know, when we look at housing development...
So I'm going to get you to get to your question. I appreciate the comments.
Yeah, so supply will always lag behind demand because it's a self-regulating system in which financiers turn off the tap of money if it looks like supply and demand might meet, let alone overshoot. Because when we overshoot, we have a major economic crisis, and everyone wants to avoid that. So how do we shift our system to meet that gap in supply and demand?
I think there's two questions in there, actually. So one is that how do you shift the system to actually deal with supply? And I think part of our answer, at least in Australia, historically has always been you directly build houses. Like, that's a starting point. Don't leave it to the market. Do something about it. But part of your question is actually about how do you get a much more sophisticated understanding of what actually is happening in our current system that opens the critique of, is that what you want? That, you know, I think it's as simple as that. And that's I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, it's an easy idea, but it's a difficult thing to do because it does require a sort of fundamental understanding of the difference between commodity and a housing market and, you know, the structures that we've got going on. But I think that being able to kind of step back into the what did we want in the first place is the open door to actually starting to unpack that a little bit and being able to draw the connections between what's happening now, why that's not working, the fact that both financiers and developers will stop developing if it's going to undermine the value of the stock that they're there now, because we live in a market economy. I mean, it's not that hard a concept for people to get their head around if it's expressed in that way. The question is, how do we build a wider range of people able to express that in ways that people can grapple with, I think.
Jen, I'm just going to follow up with a question to you that I'm going to put it to you, came through the app as well, which is a question of whether we also need a change management process for government. And how do we go about that? You know, so to exactly change that narrative that seems to be widely accepted that the problem is a lack of supply, and therefore we just need to build more and the price will come down. When we heard from Steve Rowley, no, people will build more when the price goes up.
Yeah.
I think we're all functioning in a highly complex, highly challenging, wicked problem system. So that's just the first comment. And I think across all that system actors, we're all trying to grapple with what is our role, how are we influencing, where are we all trying to get to? And I think actually being able to stand back, understand we are in very complex, challenging environment, but be able to actually structure out that complexity to not have a conversation around this is the solution, what do you think? But actually be able to say, this is the complexity, what are the main challenges we need to work on, and how do we actually work on the challenges together? Now, I know that sounds like quite a, but everyone in our system needs to be able to do that in a way that is similar to your paper. I suppose a lot of people here have probably worked in homelessness for a really long time, but probably not necessarily stood back and said, if we have to have a barbecue conversation around how we're going to structurally shift the system of homelessness, pretty intense barbecue, but let's just imagine we're at a barbecue.
Make a nice change for house
3-day
prices.
barbecue.
Yeah, but it's not. So we're in a room of practitioners here, but how do we take the conversation we're having now to a barbecue level that you'd be willing to have with your uncle? Let's just put it, your uncle. I grew up in central Queensland, if anyone knows where that is, a place called Nebo, town of 200 people. I grew up on a property 40 kilometres outside of Nebo, so small country town, 50 kids in the school, 6 of which were my family. So I understand regions, that kind of structure, and having the conversations with some of that kind of context of regional, urban, all these kind of really complex challenges, but how do you bring it down to a simplistic barbecue discussion that actually can explain the complexity, but also then phrase them as a challenge we need to be working on, not as a, what do you think of this solution? And I think government equally, so a lot of the practitioners we've been working with, local government and state government, about how to think through structuring those conversations differently in a community and being brave enough to actually not lead with solutions but lead with challenges and helping community understand the challenge first, then actually talking about strategies or solutions we've seen around the world, which ones are better fit here, or is there different ones we should be working on? But it does actually take a different mindset to how you're approaching that. But you also have to have a mindset of that approach within your own organisation first. And what we've been finding is a lot of people aren't necessarily structuring conversations in their own teams in that way. So even structuring the conversation in your team like that first, and then going to that next level is some of the, and so government are a key part of that.
Yeah, please, Amy.
I just also want to say the in thinking about the technical solutions to this very significant challenge, we have to remember that there's a broader kind of social piece around the gap that if we continue with the kinds of levels of poverty and disadvantage that we currently have in our society, the gap between anything that's, I mean, what is affordable in that context? I mean, nothing. Honestly, we know that. The data shows us that. So it's an artificial conversation if we don't extend the sort of technical complex solutions to also dealing with that. And the Canadian National Housing Strategy overtly actually goes there. It does extend the thinking around housing. And it talks about we want to boost up the middle class. Like it speaks to some of these things, and housing is a mechanism for that. And here are all the other ways that we can do that and the linkages to other systems. So I think that's an important part of it too.
Right, now we have lots of questions, so we'll take one at the front here, I think. Yep.
Thank you.
We need the microphone so everyone can hear you.
Right. Okay.
The people online can't hear you otherwise. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm Maggie Shambrook. I'm part of the Housing Older Women's Movement, so the lived experience kind of voice. And I've lived long enough to know that there was a system called the Australian Assistance Plan a long time ago now, but it did actually believe in citizen participation and did believe in the rights of citizens to have a say over the things that affect their lives. Long gone, never to return, sadly. However, I was listening to all of that, and I thought,
I'm going to keep the question.
Yeah. There's a passive.
On the question.
Sorry, there's a kind of passivity in all of it, in that citizens are sitting there waiting to be engaged with, when actually citizens have a lot of ideas about change. And one of the things that this organisation's been looking at is non-speculative housing, and I just want to I guess, evoke your thoughts about how do we activate citizens, not just survey them or engage them or, educate them as passive recipients, but how are they actually part of the solution-finding processes?
I think it's an incredibly important point, and I absolutely agree that there are there's a huge wealth of the thinking, the ideas, the lived experience that can be brought to bear. And so I think the question becomes, where are the avenues, where are the challenges, where are the channels? There's also for me how do you set that scene, how do you make sure that there is sort of adequate capacity building so that people can properly engage in a discussion. So, I've certainly been involved in consultations where if you don't set it properly, people say all sorts of stuff, but none of it is workable and it doesn't really get to the nub of the issue, and it doesn't deal with what the true constraints are and where the points of change might need to be. So I don't have a good answer for how you actually magic that out of nothing, but I absolutely agree. Finding the time, space and capacity to make those conversations happen is pretty critical.
Amy, you want to add?
Yeah. So I was in the lived experience session yesterday, and for people who were there, we should be so lucky to have been there. It was my highlight of the whole conference. And speaking of the water we're swimming in, it was in a tiny room, the smallest size room, with no live stream and no recording. It was packed to the rafters, standing room only, not even standing room, in fact. That was packed as well. So I think it shows you where we're at in terms of the readiness and the appetite for this. But just to speak to your question about, moving from that sort of passive engagement or
from surveying to kind of activating.
The ones who are holding the power, enabling just a passive engagement. That there was some excellent discussion about a whole continuum of, not even engagement really, just input, shared power, right from telling stories, which is right at the beginner sort of level, and as you said, so what, how's that going to be actually even used, and then right through to meaningful involvement in service design, service running, in CHPs, that was particularly spoken about a lot, policy design, and then right to the other end, in terms of legislating the voice of the tenant, of the service user, so that regulators can actually regulate the way services are doing that process. So there is a lot of maturity, we've got a lot of ground to cover when it comes to maturity, but the only way, I think a lot of services and government, we don't know what we don't know. So the only way to know that is to bring people in to start the process.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah,
I was just very quickly, there is some interesting, I suppose, very citizen or activist type lens, and from young people up is starting to become quite different about the types of cities they want, the types of decisions they want to see made around climate action and what that means for cities, and because that's the space we work in quite a lot. And there's groups like NumTots, New Urbanist Memes for Transit-Oriented Teens, and then I always can tell how old people are in the room if they know it. They're slightly younger than me, but they're not the TikTok generation either, so there's even a younger version of those, which is all about young, fun memes about the types of cities people are wanting and the decisions they'd like to see made. So I suppose there's ways that activist or citizenship lens are coming out and playing out very differently to marches or other things. There's social media campaigns, other ways that a lot of different things, young mayors campaign, getting young people into politics to be part of these discussions from 11 to 16. So there's a whole lot of different things that are happening as well in that space that are really important about actually that groundswell of what we want. But at the same time, you can't be an activist if you don't even know that there's a problem, which is the vast majority of a lot of people we've been hearing from in our research.
Okay, we've got lots more questions, so I'm going to get you to make them as quick as you can.
Carl Fitzgerald from Grounded Community Land Trust Advocacy. I wanted to sort of zoom out a bit in terms of systems thinking. The post-manufacturing Australian economy has revolved around big housing, big debt, big infrastructure, all driven by big immigration. So how can we actually move away from this housing and holes type mentality, mining and property development, and towards a system where there's general value-added economy front and centre again? That's what we need to move towards.
You want the revolution.
Big conversation.
I'm going to do the Q&A thing and take
Yeah.
that as a comment.
Yeah.
I think it
I have
is
no
a
answer to
really, really fundamental and important question because, I mean, we talked about the systems and we talked about, you know, over-investment in housing instead of other productive enterprise, and it goes right to that. And it also goes to the then huge financial risks that and broader economic risks that poses for the economy. But I think we don't have...
Can I just...
yeah, and then
so I think part of what you're talking about is we need to change the water. So we're swimming in this system that people are accepting is the standard and is maybe the only way. They don't actually know how to conceive of something different. There was some talk about deliberative development, less speculation. There's a discussion we need to have about getting a housing system that is tenure neutral. So it doesn't matter whether you own a house or not. At the point where you retire, you can still live well. Those questions. So I think it's a big structural question, and we have to start some conversations to make people aware that it doesn't have to be the way it is. I'll stop there.
Okay. Just speak, they'll turn you up. Yep.
Oh, right, okay, sorry. I've just been reflecting in this conference about how we're framing the issue and how we frame it, and it invariably points us in different directions in terms of policy solutions that Nicola presented. You know, I think we're very much seeing the issue as one of regulatory failure in the moment, and regulation needs to get out of the way, let the market do its thing, and we'll meet the needs of lower income groups. Alternatively, we could see it as a market failure, and that's... and I think that the comments from Peter earlier in the opening statements, we're moving towards a market-based approach and away from one that sees social and affordable housing and housing as essential infrastructure, very much reflected in the Productivity Commission's review of the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement. How do we bring this conversation back to an essential infrastructure one that's been advocated in the past by academics or Infrastructure Australia, where we feel like we're increasingly veering away from that perspective at the moment?
So interesting question. I mean, Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz actually talked about housing as essential infrastructure. So I think that was in her presentation on the opening day, which I found really encouraging, given her voice and as advisor to government. So I think we've actually shifted a bit the other way since the election of the current government. But
I think the way I'd describe it, less market failure, more system failure. We have a system failure, and from my perspective, that's partly because we're not doing a good enough job to articulate what outcomes we wanted from that system. If you have that conversation, you have to think differently about how you want the system to work, and the system brings in all of it, all of the where's the regulatory framework, where's the market framework, we control those things. So you can create a different system, take you to a different place.
Okay, question back.
Yes, talking about the unthinkable, I'd like to sort of provide a counter view. I wish we weren't so dominated by market here in Australia, and obviously we need to invest in more social and community housing. But what's wrong with using the tax system to actually incentivise people to invest in community and housing through the system? Because that's what we had with NRAS. What's wrong with it? If we want the outcome, what's wrong with it? Rather than try and stop it, why don't we actually bend the mainstream to deliver the outcomes that we want?
Okay, thanks. I don't know that anyone said there's anything wrong with using the tax system to do those.
We should absolutely use the tax system to deliver the outcomes we decided we wanted. Whether that version of it is the outcome we want, that's the conversation to have. But once you get there, use all the systems, absolutely.
Yeah. I don't think we have any disagreement on the panel about that. I mean, I would say that we're using the tax system in other ways at the moment through negative gearing, the capital gains tax discount. We're incentivising small-scale investors to buy existing properties rather than we could use similar mechanisms to encourage new construction, for example. So, yeah, okay, question just behind you here.
Thank you. I think a big part of our system is our public institutions, and I'm really interested in your thoughts on how public institutions can be empowered in the way that they were, in the post-war era to build housing and have the skills to develop really good policy and housing outcomes when the solution is increasingly being seen as outside of the government, and that the government can't invest or won't invest or can't build housing.
So when you say public systems, you mean like state housing authorities?
Yeah, like state governments,
Right.
federal governments.
So this is a really interesting question because it's a live one. You know, we're moving much more down the UK model of not-for-profit community housing providers. There is still a rearguard action that says, no, it should all be public. The Greens sometimes express, or parts of the Greens express that view. And I wonder what you think. One argument is government is so depleted of skills and resources that it would be impossible to others would say, you know, we're going down the wrong track. Nicola?
So, well, I suppose I can start quickly from this sector I know a bit more about. I think to actually make these sorts of development propositions stack up, physically be able to be built in the current sector, kind of to make mixed tenure proposition work that also includes housing, retail, you know, in an urban context. These really tricky urban change projects, they are very challenging to actually put together, make work and financially stack up. And even as a developer, I can see a few developer faces I know in the room here, it's a highly complex set of skills requirements you actually need to have. And a lot of them you actually can't, in a in like a government land organisation, you actually have to be you can't then procure things the way you currently do in the time frame it actually takes you to do things. Like there's significant challenges to actually being a government land organisation, like government land developer. And actually the complexity of that requires quite significant commercial and developer insight that actually is a highly complex set of skills. So just sort of then going, okay, well, we'll be government, we'll do that, and we'll get in-house capability to do that. The actual step to do that is significant. And then how you even procure the expertise if you don't have it in-house right now, the kind of way you procure that level of expertise and service is really quite limiting to actually getting the insight and advice you probably need to actually be able to do it. So I know that's a very specific kind of view of the challenge. I think government land organisations or the type of approach is extremely powerful, but it takes time to build that capability, and how you bridge the gap between capability gap and how you procure it to actually getting things built in the next 5 years is highly complex, although it could be extremely powerful.
There are examples, though, in other sectors, like, for example, in health in New South Wales, where there's a whole entity called Health Infrastructure, which coordinates that extremely complex process. And I worked in hospital development for many years. So that's a decision and an investment that the government wants to hold that and coordinate that. And I think just one more brief thing. There's been a new Labor government elected in New South Wales, and the noises coming from the minister now is that she's very supportive of, I suppose, bolstering that government capability, the Land and Housing Corporation, and doing what's within they've done what they can immediately within the government's purview in that regard, and we're also moving to a new sort of integrated Homes New South Wales setup. So, I mean, I think we can watch this space there.
Victoria's
and
going back to having a state electricity commission.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I suspect I'd be much more agnostic about the delivery mechanism. I think the bit that matters, I think it's horses for courses. Who should be doing what function and who is best placed to do the what function. And I think the biggest deal in there is government is actually, and at its various levels, is the only place where you can set the framework that makes the rules. If you make the rules well, then you've got much more freedom to move in terms of how, what delivery mechanisms might actually deliver against. And some of that, so government has a role both in setting like the kind of the regulation, the structure about what you can and can't do and how well you have to do it and what you need to meet, but also where the funding's supposed to come from. So, you need both of those things. If both of those things are lined up, maybe cards on the table. I spent a long time in the community housing sector. I don't share the view that public housing needs to be all owned by the government. In fact, in many instances, I think it is faster, better, higher quality, meets the need better when it's delivered by a wider range of people using a wider range of mechanisms. But it also depends what water you're in. It depends,
Okay, look, I'm sorry I haven't got time to take any more questions or get to your questions. We have a date with morning tea. But I'm sure our three speakers will be happy to be buttonholed by you. And please join me in thanking them for excellent presentations.
Thanks, everyone. We might get started. Good morning, my name's Mark Wall and I'm from the Department of Housing, and I'm very delighted to be able to run this session about head leasing. But first and foremost, I'd obviously like to acknowledge the owners of the land that we meet, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to elders both past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that this is a virtual session as well, and to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of the people who are virtually logging in on this site. I hope all participants have enjoyed the conference over the last 3 days, and for new visitors to Brisbane for the first time, I hope to see you back and hope you'd like to spend some time travelling through the vast parts of Queensland. There's great opportunities in the outback and regional areas, which I've had the opportunity to go and see. And so, yes, if you ever want to come back to Queensland, please enjoy the time. I'd just like to also say Michael Fotheringham and the Ahuri team, as well as the Brisbane Convention team staff for a wonderful conference. You know, I think it's all gone well, and I'd particularly like to thank Liza Windle and the team from our team from the Department of Housing, who've been working with Ahuri now for nearly over a year and putting forward this conference. So thank you very much to my team. Also, we've got Bridge Housing here, and I'd like for their support and their sponsorship of this session, so thank you, Rebecca. This session is being streamed and recorded and will be available for delegates after the conference, like many of the others. And today we'll be taking questions both online and also in the room. So for those joining online, please use your Q&A tab on the right of your screen, and if you've had any of the presentations, I'll be able to see them. For those in the room, obviously when we ask a question, if you can keep it succinct and be able to either provide who you are and which state you may be from, and to who the question might be able to acknowledge to. It's also important that we acknowledge the people who have had lived experience of housing vulnerability at this conference and sharing their experience, and acknowledge that those people's stories are very important to us all. As I mentioned, I'm Mark Wall, as the General Manager of Housing Delivery within the Queensland Housing Department. I've had the wonderful opportunity now for nearly over 32 odd years to work in many parts of the state, and also to deliver a range of programs that include capital programs across this vast state, and seen very first-hand how a home can change someone's life, help them change their outlook, build their confidence, and be able to look at some of the challenges over in their lives to come. My kids got a bit tired, or every time we went travelling, I'd be jumping underneath caravan parks and seeing what the mobile home, builder was, or going past land parcels somewhere in some part of the state and having a look at it. But, I'm quite proud to be able to show my kids in the past that as they go through that, I've been involved in making some changes out in most of the parts of Queensland of what we've built and done. But today we're here again to talk about head leasing programs and how they've been used in the past and how they're currently being used in this tight housing market, and also what are the opportunities that we can do something differently into the future. At its purest sort of aspect, head leasing really starts as more of a commercial transaction between the lessee and the owner, lessor and the owner, between an organisation or the lessee to rent a property at a market rent and possibly some other costs that might be associated depending on the contract, who then, does that to a tenancy agreement with a tenant to be able to either at market rent or at some sort of reduced rent. Depending on the head lease contract, the owner may still have a number of obligations for the property, or those obligations are taken on by the lessee. There's been many variations that are out there on any given day of the week, where we've got employers who are doing work in country towns or in regional areas at the moment, who are head leasing properties for their staff to be able to complete that work. There are investment models like the Defence Housing Authority, which have been around for many years, that provide that different investment model for the defence staff. You have local governments renting properties for its staff in communities, and through the state government agencies such as Department of Housing and others, who will either directly lease properties off the market, or we also fund a range of non-government organisations to be able to source and lease properties, mainly for use for various reasons, for crisis, medium or long-term accommodation. For the longer the term of the lease, obviously the more certainty for all, and that, though, however, does depend on funding streams and the future use of what the owner might want to use the property for. Now today I have 3 members from different states who are on the panel to talk about how we're delivering head leasing in their states and what it might look like in the future, and be able to open up this conversation about this very important aspect. I have Harry Smith, who is the head of the strategic initiatives of Haven Home Safe Haven, and works in a range of internal and external stakeholders to explore and develop initiatives that work to address homelessness and provide positive outcomes for people seeking stable and affordable housing. With over 25 years' experience within both government and not-for-profit sectors, holding key leadership and governance roles across a number of programs, he brings a deep understanding of the various drivers and complexities underpinning homelessness and affordable housing. Welcome, Harry. I have Teresa Reid, homegrown CEO for Mangrove Group of companies that include Mangrove Housing, which is a Tier 2 community housing provider, Mangrove Realty and Mangrove Maintenance and Cleaning. Teresa is also founder of the Forgotten Women Project, an initiative aimed at providing housing for women over 55 who experience or at risk of homelessness. And in her spare time, she works as co-founder, as a Jack Reed Foundation, a not-for-profit organisation that delivers haircuts for homelessness. Welcome. And we have Rebecca Pinkstone, the CEO of Bridge Housing, who leads a committed team of 100 staff providing housing services that change their lives. As more than 5,600 people live in some 3,500 odd properties. Bridge Housing social and affordable housing programs across metropolitan Sydney. Before joining Bridge Housing in 2013, Rebecca worked for the New South Wales Government, a variety of senior roles to deliver major social housing and forms to improve services and growing the community housing sector. You'll see their bios online. So very much welcome, panel members. We've had a bit of a conversation before. Each one's going to take a different perspective, which I think is great. I always say to my staff, look at things through a different lens, and then being able to look at all those lenses and see what you can get out of that and how we can turn things into the future. So Harry's going to kick off first with his presentation, and then followed by Teresa and then Rebecca. They've lined up nicely for me so I don't forget and that. So welcome everyone, and I'll hand over to Harry.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to elders past and present. And it's great that we get to stand here and talk about the incredibly exciting, sexy topic of head leasing. It's kind of a step up from maintenance and just below evictions in the whole thing. And I'm really, really surprised actually that so many people have turned up. Day 3, last session, dinner last night. For those who went to the dinner and were accosted by about 15 people standing there with trays of drinks, it turned into a very good night indeed. So yes, talking about head leasing from our perspective, it's great actually with the other panel members here. We've had a look at each other's presentations and we are taking quite a bit of a different perspective. As Mark said, I work for Haven Home Safe. We are based in Victoria. We're a homelessness organisation that has housing options as well. So we've been about 40 years in the making. We've got about 2,500 houses that we operate, own and manage on behalf of the department. But we are at our heart a homelessness organisation with entry points in Mildura, Swan Hill, Bendigo and Preston in northern Melbourne. So we get to see a whole range of different people from different perspectives coming to us. We are kind of the organisation that has always taken the approach of, and maybe in hindsight a little bit too loosely, of we don't say no to anything. We've always worked with government and other people to say, we'll give it a crack. We don't say no, we say why not. Now that's been a really good model to be really inclusive, working with a lot of different communities and a lot of different stakeholders. But clearly the sector is changing, and as a part of our journey with head leasing, which I'll step you through in a moment, we've learned some really valuable lessons about we need to probably put a little bit more rigour into some of the processes and some of the tendering that we go through. And I think we've all probably learnt that as well. Not saying that we're reckless, not saying that we just jump in and do anything and jeopardise the organisation. We take a very strategic approach to everything that we do. But things like, and for those who may have seen our CEO speak yesterday in one of the plenary sessions, Trudy Ray was talking about our response to the devastating floods this time last year throughout Victoria and particularly in Rochester. Government knows that they can come to us and say, all right, we need to sort this out. What can we do? And we'll say, yep, we'll get on with it. But we need to step back a little bit at times and say, there needs to be more of a commercial lens that we put through this. We deal with vulnerable clients. Client is at the core of everything that we do, and everyone in the room would no doubt feel the same. But sometimes not taking as commercial a lens as what you can jeopardise the client journey as well. And that's another learning that we're all, I think, reconciling with. So I'll go through it. What I'm going to do is just, I'm a bit of a storyteller. There's quite a few slides. There's a bit of detail on the slides, but I'm not going to talk to every point. I just want to give an idea of how our journey from the client perspective kind of worked out with this so-called head leasing model. It's been a long journey. So we first used head leasing for us for a program that we tendered for and was successful as a part of a response to supporting victim survivors of domestic and family violence. And it kind of worked through there. That was what we called our Moving On program. And then we had this Housing Now program and a thing called Home Stretch and then targeted care packages and homelessness to a home. And I could go on and on. It's now stepping into potentially supporting prison release program. We've worked with male perpetrators of domestic violence as a part of trying to help them work through their journey as well. And it has become quite a complex process. We'll start with Moving On. This is probably our most proudest program in this area that we think has worked really well. Victim survivors of domestic violence. We structured the program. It was funded over 5 consecutive years and it grew every year. And so what we did is we had this opportunity, this funding, and we're supposed to go out to the private sector and private rental market and head lease some properties and then help the clients move into it. And pretty much every other agency in Victoria that took on this program got the funding, went out, procured all of the properties, head leased the properties, and then worked with the various support agencies to support the women to come through the program. And I say women because it was predominantly women. I think of all the clients we had, there were 2 males that participated, but over the 5 years, it was all women for reasons I don't need to elaborate on here. So the other agencies went and did that. But for whatever reason, I've actually tried to work this out corporately. And this is what I love about the organisation. I said, why did we do the model that we did? Because this was about a year before I came to the organisation. And I can't get a solid answer, but everyone I talk to says, it was my idea, it was my idea, it was my idea. And I love that. So people have taken real ownership of this. Essentially, though, what we did, we had the funding there, and then we started to work with the support agencies to say, well, what women, families do you have and who would be eligible for the program? And we recognised very early on that it wasn't about just getting in very early when there's a lot of trauma involved. There's other agencies that do that and there's other supports around. But we said, well, what women do you know that have suffered trauma and still getting supported at the moment? And it's about moving on, and that's where we got our name from, Moving On. So we had a panel set up and we would sit there and we'd read through the applications, and some women would nominate to the program because they'd heard about it, and other agencies would support their clients to come into the program. And then if we thought, yeah, this is good, because it's about setting people up for success, we didn't want to set people up for failure. So then if they were accepted, we said, yep, we've got the money, you go and have a look at realestate.com, you find the rental that you want and that you think that you would like to potentially move into longer term, and then we'll go and head lease it. And that's the way that it worked. So they would say, wow, this is fantastic. You've got to remember most of the clients, if not all of the clients, had lost their choice. They didn't have the opportunity to make decisions. They were dealing with that sort of trauma. So it was about giving them the space and the opportunity to reclaim their life and make a decision, make a choice. Where did they want to live? Not some bureaucrat telling them where to live. Where did they want to live? And so we offered a discounted market, a discount on the rent to them based on their income, and we scaled it up over the period of support that they had, with the intent that hopefully in the end they could take on the private lease. And that's a great outcome for everyone. So we would step out, they would have their property, they've been there, we'd help them establish a rental history, and I think that was really clear as well. You flee domestic violence, you're on the lease, you have had to go and your life is in complete turmoil, and you end up being blacklisted because you're on the lease and rent wasn't paid and you go through VCAT. And so there's no way you can get back into the rental market. So we really tried to support every single client that came through for success to be able to move on with their life and reclaim their independence. 58 real estate agents participated in the program over the years. 20 of those leased multiple properties, which was fantastic. So we went back to the real estate agents and we were able to lease multiple properties from the one real estate agent. So that's a fantastic success rate. The agent said, look, this is working really well. What we essentially did, we'd go out, we would pay 12 months lease, and then we would sublease, and then the participant would pay us and we'd scale up her contribution over the period of time until she could take on that financial stability at the end. 150 clients supported, 105 actually took over the leases, which was fantastic when I went back and had a look at the numbers, and 15 actually moved into social public housing, and then there are other things that happened as well, but they were the key figures. I should step back a little bit and say, why did I want to do this analysis? Because head leasing in our organisation really became quite polarising. And I've got people who would say it's a great program and we should do more of it, and I've had people say this is a ridiculous program, we need to get out of it. And this is across a range of different areas between finance and maintenance and the tenancy managers. And so I wanted to just unpack the data and say what worked and what didn't work. So I'm not standing here saying I'm an absolute advocate for head leasing. I'll take you on the journey, I'll get to my assessment at the end, but that's where this came from. So in 150 clients supported, 105 stayed in the property. I reckon that's a pretty good outcome. During the COVID lockdown though, particularly those of us in Melbourne within the Ring of Steel, it went pear-shaped in the last year. In that last year, we had 3 evictions for rent arrears, 2 abandoned the property, 5 moved back with the partner, and a number we don't know what happened, they just essentially up and left. 2018 comes along, we go into this Housing Now one. This is supporting homeless people in rural areas. Clients again nominated, we went, hey, this other program's working, let's not just go and head lease 10 properties, let's see where they want to live. And so they were able to, again, go through realestate.com, have a look at where they wanted to live. They searched for the property themselves. We had 9 real estate agents involved. This is in rural and regional areas. 10 clients were supported. 9 of them stayed in that private rental. So it can work. And 1 was evicted because obviously we're dealing with a client group that has a lot of other complexities in their life as well. Moved into Homestretch. It started 2019. I've given it a Homestretch name. There's actually little names that agencies were funded for. It started in 2019, still current at the moment. This is where government actually funded a support agency. And if any of you got the chance to go and see, there's been 2 presentations on supporting young people, one on Tuesday, one on Wednesday. If you went to it, you'll see what these organisations are doing for young people is extraordinary. And if you didn't get a chance to see it, they've been recorded, go back and have a look at it. So we worked with 2 particular agencies, Berry Street and Wombat. They got the money to support the young kids. Basically, how it works, multi-year program, the support agency supports these young kids coming out of residential care, and they identify them early. They support them before they turn 18, and then during the transition into independent living, and after as well. Fabulous program, because we forget, a lot of kids don't know how long you should leave chicken on the bench for, because they didn't grow up in a stable house. They don't know how to clean an oven. How do you clean a fridge? How do you cook? And so the support agencies wrapped these services around, which was fantastic, and then came to us. We would work with them. Okay, young kids ready to move out. Where do they want to live? See the theme again. We would go and head lease, and we do that on a case-by-case basis. To date, 21 clients have completed the program. 11 are still in the program. 10 have stayed in the private house or moved in with their partner or with family or someone. 2 abandoned. We've had 0 evictions. A really stable program. I love it. Then we've got this other program in the department in Victoria as well. It's called Targeted Care Packages. Similar, young kids, same cohort, but these are kids that may not, and I'm going to call them kids. I actually changed this to young people, trying to be politically correct. They're kids. And if one thing I've learnt from the 2 sessions I went to is earlier this week, they are kids. And so they need support around them. These are kids that are in child protection, about to exit resi care. They could be in really precarious housing situation. So the government designs this package, puts a package around it, comes to the sector, we're registered to be able to deliver it, and they will come to us. We will work with the support agency, again on a case-by-case basis. Gets a little bit flaky though. I've had phone calls from senior directors in child protection in particular regions saying, we've got a kid that turns 18 in 3 weeks, can you help us? How long's the kid been in the system for? Since they were 9. And you only just realised now that they turn 18 in 3 weeks? So there's some teething problems. Nevertheless, we turn up, we give it a go, and we work with the organisations to try and support them, to put them into, again, some sort of a head lease. 24 participated. One has actually been offered 4 different properties. They've sort of moved around the system because, you know what, young kids need the space to be able to move where they want. We're not about locking them in to live here in your forever home. Depends on where you want to live. 24 real estate agents. I got that wrong, didn't I? One has offered us 4 properties to date. 29 packages we have been funded for so far. 15 have moved into some sort of long-term housing. One was incarcerated, one abandoned the property. Still not bad stats. Then we get to, and I can see my colleague sitting at the front here, Homelessness to a Home, a fantastic program that was set up in the middle of, again, COVID. We picked up all of the people who were living rough and we put them into hotels. 1,825 or 65, might have been 1,865 were identified in that process. We solved homelessness overnight in Victoria because we put them all in hotels. But then we went, what are we going to do next? We need to get them out. So the government funded this fantastic program of moving these people into some sort of housing. I had a good idea in the department. It was a bit of a brain spark. We've sort of got capacity. The department said to put half of those into public housing, but the other half, let's just head lease at the moment. Let's try and get some housing now principles, wrap around, and let's work out what we can do to get them into some sort of a longer term situation. And you know, Haven, you've head leased before, as with a few other organisations. Can you guys go and head lease and let's work together on this? These are people suffering chronic homelessness. Now we've picked them up again and we've put them into the private rental sector. There was always going to be some very, very interesting outcomes indeed. We got funded for a couple of different areas, in particular in Geelong and then in Bendigo-Mildura. Geelong was great. We had 61 clients. We managed to house them all in private rental. It took a while. We got there in the end. It was a new program for us. We wrapped the supports around them, worked with some other agencies. In that particular one, 24 separate real estate agents participated. 16 offered multiple. They said, yeah, this is pretty good. One offered 9 properties over the journey. 9 properties. There were 2 evictions, 1 abandoned. Bendigo-Mildura. Hang on, went a bit pear-shaped here because there was no rental properties. Everyone fled Melbourne. Everyone got out after the COVID restrictions were lifted and they went into the rural area. There were no houses to head lease. There was nothing. Only 9 head leases were obtained in total. There was 6 in 2021, 3 in 2022. That was it. And we still had about 40 clients. We had nowhere to put them. I had Bendigo at one stage less than 1% vacancy rate during 2021. It was difficult. Only 1 client stayed in private rental. We eventually moved all the clients. The department went and purchased property and were able to move them into long-term housing. Some came into our vacancies as well. There's a summary. I just want to put the figures up. These slides have been made available, but this is, in summary, how we've performed. And I found this quite fascinating. 233 head leases is what we've had to date, 324 subleases, because a lot of times we would sublease to multiple. Real estate agents involved, we've had 114 real estate agents involved that have wanted to partner with us, and that is terrific. How many of them had 2 or more head leases? 51 of them. 5 or more head leases, 12. The real estate agent with most head leases, one had 11 head leases with us and is still such an advocate for this program, wants to be a part, rings us up and says, I've got another property, do you have any clients in any of your programs? Because we want to support you, which is fantastic. How many were across 2 or more programs? So moving on, housing now, 23 agencies have been across multiple. 1 has been across 4 of our different programs. In the subleases, 287, of the 287 that have concluded, 131 have remained in the private rental, 49 moved into public housing, 43 moved into affordable housing, and 3 moved into some sort of supported accommodation. It's not bad. 78% of people, by giving them a home, wrapping the services around, using the private rental market, we've had outcomes for. On the flip side, 8 were abandoned, 7 evicted, 2 moved interstate, 2 incarcerated. And the other ones, we don't know. We record as not sure what happened. And that's been a bit of the learning that we've had and a bit of the failings. What are the overall learnings? As I summarise, head leasing can clearly achieve positive long-term outcomes for clients if done well. Allows them to gain independence, allows them to get a rental history, move on from social welfare dependency. If you can get people that don't go into social housing, isn't that a fantastic outcome for everyone, just by giving them the chance? Work educational outcomes have improved because of the stable accommodation. And we allow people to establish a lifestyle, but it's administratively complex. That's our biggest learning. It's very burdensome. Competitive rental market makes it really hard. We're getting out there to try to head lease with people. We're having to apply for 15, 16, 17 properties at time for one person. Many applications, low rental availability. Lease sign-off processes differ from agency to agency. It can be a bit difficult. We've got to get our CEO to execute the head lease. You're dealing with owners, agents, support agencies, maintenance people. We lose a little bit of control and we're dealing with a lot of different parties. What are the takeaways? 1 client equals minimum 2 leases. You are head leasing, you are subleasing. Sometimes you're subleasing multiple times. Don't underestimate the extra management that's required. Managing the real estate agents and the landlords is a specific skill set. Our tenancy managers work well with the clients. It was a new skill set to learn how to negotiate and manage rents going up the line for the head lease. Empowering the client to choose a rental property is key. That is the one thing we've found. We get them involved and we give them the choice. Relationship management, one bad renter experience, we all have them, can really kill the relationship. You need rental properties in the first place. Support agencies have to be involved, and the big thing, head leasing is not a substitute. It is not a substitute for social housing stock, in our opinion. We have seen it work, but that is the key thing. It's an additional pathway to independence, but not something that government can abrogate the responsibility to push into the private rental market. It can work if it's done well. That's it for me. I shall pass over to my colleague.
I'm happy to be bridge housing. Oh, someone left their phone here.
That's all I did.
Good morning. My name is Teresa Reid and occasionally I'm the CEO of Mangrove Housing. I would like to acknowledge the First Nations people on whose lands we meet and view today. For those of you who are here with a hangover from last night's dinner, I really am sympathetic to that. Slightly sore myself. For those of you who are just hanging in for the end of the conference, I promise I'll be short. To help with everyone's associative learning today, I'm going to talk about head leasing while we learn some fun facts which are useful at pub quiz about monopoly. Hopefully this will work. The first fun fact is like all good ideas, monopoly was originally invented by a woman and then it was stolen by a man. Sorry. The original game was called the Landlord's Game and it was designed to teach landlords not to be greedy and exploit their tenants, which is incredibly different to where Monopoly got to. So for me, it's a little bit actually like head leasing. Monopoly started out in one very different way to the way it's ended up, and that's kind of our experience. So I'm going to talk a bit about our experience, but each one of us kind of incorporates everyone else's speech in terms of we do person-centred as well, all that kind of stuff. And so I've concentrated on a slightly different bend to that. Oh, that worked. Excellent. First, I'll talk a little bit about us. So we're Mangrove Housing. We're a Tier 2 community housing provider, so I'm sitting in between two juggernauts. It's been fun. I would like to learn a lot from these guys. We have about 650 properties, but we head lease about 163 properties at any given time during the year. We spend $2 million on properties for head leasing each year, so quite a substantial number. A fun fact, the total funds in a Monopoly bank, if you've played Monopoly, is only $20,580. That's the most you can make out of the bank in Monopoly, which is very close to what we spend on a property each year. And it's very close to how much I need to pay a mortgage off each year. So just stick with that fact for a moment. Traditionally in Queensland, head leasing occurs within transitional housing programs. So there's quite a few and we deliver a lot of them. Just like the average game of Monopoly, it's only supposed to take about 90 minutes to play it. I've never played a game of Monopoly that only took 90 minutes. Transitional head leasing has increasingly become long-term head leasing. I've got some people in a 2-year program that have been there 10 years because supply and a number of other things that we'll talk about. Some fun facts to help that sink in. The longest game of Monopoly took 70 days to complete, which is how long it feels when I play Monopoly with my 8-year-old. Over. The longest underwater game of Monopoly, I don't know how that works, was 50 hours. It's a challenge, Mark. While I'm a fan of head leasing, it's increasingly having less impact. I call it less for more. There's a number of reasons that that's happening, and lots of it is about we're propping up a supply shortage. So unfortunately, it's not having the impact that it should. And there's a different set of clients that are now coming through head leasing than we traditionally had before. Our company was built on head leasing 30 years ago. We actually was one of the few programs that we did deliver. So we've got a long history, and like I said, I'm a big fan of it, but it's got to change. For us, head leasing in 2023 is a new game. So it's expensive for lots of reasons. First is that the rent costs a lot. Brisbane today is now the second least affordable city to rent in. That's a huge change from the marketplace that we look at. Maintenance costs are astounding in terms of what has to be done to bring some properties back to the condition we want. And certainly the longer term we have the tenant in there, the longer likely that we'll have some maintenance costs done. For us, head leasing is becoming, our $2 million is going less and less. It's getting less and less from the marketplace. It's competitive. Fun fact, the least popular token in Monopoly is the wheelbarrow. Increasingly, we find ourselves feeling like the wheelbarrow when we turn up to ask landlords and places, can we do head leasing? I was telling my colleagues just before that I went to a meeting with a fairly large real estate agency that has lots of real estates across, lots of agencies across Brisbane. 4 hours it took them to fill a property. They never even saw one tenant. They just took applications and went, that's the one that we want. Increasingly, we're not competitive in that market when we're talking with them. Much of what used to be attractive for head leasing isn't anymore because the marketplace is already meeting it. So guaranteed rent, great, there's full occupancy anyway at the moment. Why take the risk on the wheelbarrow? You can have the shoe or the hat. I like the hat. If you haven't played Monopoly, this is really bad, sorry. And really should. It's no longer transitional or short-term, and the benefits of the speed of being able to pick something up from the marketplace and the short-term turnaround and the short-term costs are gone because effectively now it's more like long-term. I think head leasing works its best in a balanced marketplace. When you've got a supply shortage like we have now, it wreaks havoc on the way that this program can work best for us. A fun fact is a way to make the most money in Monopoly game is to own all 4 railway stations. I did not know. Interestingly, it's actually one of our strategies, and I'll talk about it in a second, about working with railway stations. And that's about finding supply in new places. So for us, we've kind of adapted the program as we've gone along, and we've adapted to the marketplace. A Monopoly game can actually be won in 13 seconds. I can't wait to find out where that fact's from and if it's true, and how do I do it, because it will solve so many nights at my house. So here I am with our 13 seconds of strategies. We focus our resources and our target on a specific market. So one of the things that we do in Brisbane, particularly if you're in Brisbane Council area, you're about to be punished greatly if you have a short-term stay accommodation because you're going to pay a lot of additional costs and additional rates. So we target those types of establishments and go, we'd like to head lease for a couple of years, thank you. And we'll meet at a particular price point for them that both saves them money and actually locks it in for us. And short stay is actually really quite nice accommodation. We target a cohort sometimes, so older women, and when Mark introduced me, he talked about we have a project called the Forgotten Women. It's a really easy target group to market to. Everyone wants to help older women, and so we find sometimes that's an angle into a lot of head leasing as an opportunity to say, look, we've got this one cohort that everyone believes is, will be a fantastic tenant, and they are, which is great. We target unusual supply opportunities like rails. Who knew? But all rail stations have a master's rail house attached to them. So we target places like that and rent off places like Queensland Rail, like Main Roads, who've repossessed homes for roads that won't be built for about a decade. So while it's short term, it's not really short term. So there's opportunities that we focus on there. We target developers. You build it, we'll rent it. I like to say that. Also like to target real estate. So go, instead of the wheelbarrow, we like to turn up and go, we're a $2 million customer. We'd like you to help us meet the need of what we've got here, and you only have to deal with me. So you've got all these economies of scale and savings with just having to deal with us. We also focus on prevention versus crisis intervention. So at the moment, and through our Forgotten Women program, and for all the people from Queensland in here, I know the allowable expenditure rules. This is our own money. One of the things that we do is we do rental top-up, so we don't head lease at all, but we go in and go, you're going to lose your property if you're not getting an extra $50 a week, particularly with the older women cohort, and we top it up. So we have a deal with them to make sure that we can get them through, because it's much harder to find her a property when she's homeless than it is if we just kept her in it in the first place. So we've kind of changed the head leasing thought. We will get into head leases if they want, but usually we just want to keep what was already happening still in there. We would like to do investment versus expenditure, and I believe we're going to hear about how that might happen anyway. For my mind, $2 million is a lot of money. I've been in this job for 8 years. That's 16 million. Hopefully my CFO says that's right. That's a lot of money that I would like to invest it in our own properties. One of the things that stops us at the moment is that we can't head lease our own properties, but I'm certainly happy to get a mortgage. And if we can head lease to ourselves, it's an opportunity for us to turn that money that would have gone into the rental market into actual long-term asset. And a final fun fact, the Parker brothers originally rejected the idea. They later paid $500 for it, and it's currently worth $1.4 billion. I think the lesson from Monopoly for me is that if you take a risk on some of the opportunities that you can have, you actually can win big in using head leasing. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Rebecca Pinkstone and I'm the CEO of Bridge Housing. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Yarraga people, and just really looking forward to the referendum, and I'm very hopeful that we'll have a yes vote, but it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm going to talk about a head leasing program that we've had in New South Wales and Bridge Housing's experience, and I won't duplicate because my colleagues have really summed up the issues that we're facing in New South Wales as well. So I will be touching on some different themes that have come up for us. So Bridge Housing is a Tier 1 provider. We manage around 3,500 properties in metropolitan Sydney, and obviously we've come to know what the rental market is like in Sydney. 1% vacancy rate. It was actually less than that. Somebody was telling me on the weekend the rates are actually under 1% in Sydney. We operate across metropolitan Sydney, and the head leasing program that we administer has been a fundamental part of the way that social housing is delivered in New South Wales for over 20 years. And Bridge Housing is one of the providers that's always managed head leasing as a type of social housing supply. So we currently head lease 645 properties off the private rental market. We have an annual leasing program of $13 million. And we have administered that program for over 15 years. So it's a permanent part of the system in New South Wales. And what it's really done in New South Wales has been providing an option for us in very, very high cost markets to meet individual needs. And in New South Wales, it's a little bit different to how it operates in other states. Our head leasing program has actually been a major vehicle for our Housing First programs. So at the moment, we manage the largest Housing First program. Over 150 of our tenants that are moving straight from the street to home are actually based in head lease properties rented off the private rental market. So it's always been the type of program that has been a social housing long-term response, but we've particularly targeted different client cohorts through that. And Housing First, if anyone knows about Housing First internationally, head leasing is a big component of Housing First programs around the world. It's not all capital supply, and there's some reasons for that. But what we're really noticing is it is very complicated to manage a head leasing program of this size. We've got multiple relationships with real estate agents and owners, and we're seeing that we're actually facing, just like everyone renting in the private rental market, huge increases in costs across that program. So at the moment, we have a very good relationship with my colleagues DCJ who fund this program. They tell us, Bridge Housing, here's $13 million, deliver 610 units in the private market. If you get any savings, you can rent more for people. And the reason that we've got a few more is because we, like other jurisdictions, have had rapid responses to COVID and homelessness programs. So our head leasing is actually higher than our usual amount of 610 properties because we're responding to those Housing First programs that we've had in New South Wales. But it's really complicated to manage. It's lots of different relationships. And we, like everyone else in the private rental market in the last year alone, have had a 43% increase in the number of 90-day no grounds notices evictions that we're facing. 56% of our properties have had rent increases. And if you look at that, that's double what we had last year. And 28% of those properties that we're picking up now are over the median rate in the private rental market. And the way that we can manage this to the $13 million is because of scale. And I'll talk about some of the pros and cons now. So for us, head leasing is fantastic because it's quick. You can really go in, head lease a property and resolve someone's homelessness immediately. And it's really good because you can engage those people, particularly people who are moving straight from the street to home, in the process of selecting their own home. They engage in that program, they go to the property, and you're there walking alongside them to select a property that meets their needs. So it's great in that way. It can really help us to resolve needs quickly. It's flexible, and for us, it's also helped us meet particular client needs that we can't meet in social housing capital supply, particularly around things like disability housing, where we need to have a particular need, or where we have a woman escaping domestic violence that can't live in a particular area anymore. You can really be flexible and make sure that that house meets their need in an area that suits them. It also doesn't have the same issues around, I suppose, concentrated social housing, and it's much more of a salt and pepper approach. You're just living in the local community with your kids, and you're able to engage in that area like you always have, and everyone in the private rental market is. But there's some real problems. The administration of the program is very complex. So we at Bridge Housing have the largest head lease program in Australia, and we've set a whole team up to manage our head lease program. And that's because it's very different to managing social housing. The people that work in that team are real estate agents. They're part of our not-for-profit real estate agency. They understand how real estates work. They help our team to negotiate the lease. They do end-of-tenancy costs and all of the costs associated with moving people out. They help negotiate that because it's a different skill set. We've also faced a lot of discrimination in the private rental market in our Housing First programs. And it's made us really think about what we head lease now. We do not go for head lease properties, for example, where there's a high proportion of owners who are strata. As soon as they find out that there's somebody coming in from homelessness, we've had 90-day notices issued. So we're really clear about where we use head leasing, the properties that we target, and how we rent them to get the best outcome for that client. It's not as stable as social housing. On average, our social housing tenants move in and stay in social housing. At least 2.5 times people move in the head lease program. So there's benefits, but they move 2.5 times on average throughout their tenancy. Now, in New South Wales, we consider that to be stable housing. So, of course, we help that person move, But anyone that's been through the process of moving and relocating knows how stressful it is. Even when you've got a landlord walking alongside you and saying, we're going to make sure you've got another property. It's a hugely stressful experience, and it's really expensive. It's expensive for us when we do the end of tenancy costs, and it's expensive for our tenants when they have to relocate and set up at their new home. So it's not a cheaper option, it's actually more expensive than capital supply. One of the issues that our staff grapple with is we are actually competitors with low-income people in the private rental market struggling to find a home. That's an ethical issue that we really struggle with, and our staff struggle with as well, because it means that every property that we're picking up for someone, we know there's someone else missing out who would be able to access that home. And I would just say, I don't think it's value for money over time unless we really look at head leasing programs and how we're going to transform them to make them a permanent part of the system and think about what we're doing. And in New South Wales, I have to say that DCJ has been fantastic at thinking about this. How do we transform the head lease program? You know, we have $13 million. It's over $200 million, the head leasing program in New South Wales. How do we transform that to make it a better product for our tenants and also value for money for government? So some of the things that we're thinking about at Bridge Housing is how do we use that leasing subsidy and actually transform it to capital supply? So what we're doing is looking at where we have the demand for housing in our particular areas and spot purchasing those properties in the city so that we can hold on to them for capital supply. And those properties there are all properties that we've bought off the private rental market. We use the leasing subsidy that we're getting from government. We combine it with our own funds and cheap finance and loans from NIFIC. And we've been able to transform now to 186 units that are now capital supply units held into perpetuity. The other thing that we're doing is saying, how do you transform it through institutional investment and impact investment? Because community housing providers are doing great work, and we know that permanent housing creates great outcomes. So we're partnering with institutional investors who will purchase those properties, we will lease them, and they will hold them for at least 10 years. So that means that we know that when we're moving someone into that home, we're moving a family in, that they've got that home for at least 10 years, maybe longer, depends on the property. But they've got it for 10 years, they can create that stability and they won't have to move. And so we're working at the moment with Conscious Investment Management. They've also worked down here in Victoria with Haven to really look at how we can purchase properties and use that leasing subsidy so that we can create stability for tenants. So those are the things that we can do. I think we need to acknowledge now that head leasing is a part of our social housing system. We need to think of it like that. What are the policy settings we need to put around that program to create stability for tenants, to create value for money for government, and to make it really efficient for community housing providers to run? Thanks.
Thanks very much, panel. And as you can see, each panel member came from a different perspective about some of the work that's happening on the ground and how we could sort of potentially change the narrative on this over many years. I've always said to my staff, so, you know, we had a community rent scheme program. It was written by a bureaucrat in the 90s. You know, like, you know, not me, I wasn't around there. Yeah. Oh, I probably was, but no. But you know, the difference is that things can change. You know, like just because that's what the world like in the housing market in the 90s or 2000 or even 2 years ago is totally different again now. So why would we expect that what we thought about and wrote about, that might have been good policy in different years? And I think a lot of the, you know, social housing arrangements. And I think there's another about what social housing is into the future, you know, how it's about helping those people on the lowest ability to be able to get a housing, and what does that look like. So we'll open up to opportunity to have questions from the floor, as well as hopefully people online. If there's anyone virtually online, my staff are sitting here waiting to me to completely muck that up and not be able to use the iPad, so I've got to prove them wrong. I'm on this great deal of stress about that. But I suppose one of the first conversations about to have is this issue between a relationship between owner and landlord and yourselves, and how you see at the moment in today's world, that you do build that competitive advantage to be able to work with owners and real estate agents in a different way? And are you seeing that changing with owners and landlords? Each of you to comment about?
Do you want to start? Look, I think for us it's both. I agree with what you were saying before about strata is really painful, and individual owners, there's a lot of administration. And individual owners, and they are changing, but there's a real, it's my asset, and they have a real ownership over it, and don't like some of the things in terms of renting it out. So I love dealing with the real estate. So I actually think that's a really economies of scale for both of us, and we actually have a good opportunity to talk about things we need to put into place to make that work better for the tenants and to make sure that everything's running smoothly for the owner and keep them quite happy. So I'm sorry, I'm looking at you because you did the speech yesterday, and I was thinking there's a very hard-working property manager in the audience, and I'm like, exactly, where we can find efficiencies and similarities and make it work. So.
And I think it's certainly the same for us as well. The relationship's really interesting. I think, and even being at the conference, seeing the different people that have been involved from the private sector across a whole range. Like, we've got investors here, we've got people from the department, there's people from the agencies. I think everyone's recognised that the current issues that we have right now is everyone's responsibility to be involved. And so we've found that a lot of owners want to step up. We started with the real estate agents obviously in moving on, and we developed some really good relationships, and people wanted to come back. The real estate agents have said, I've got some other owners, I spoke to them about it, they're keen to be involved. Go right through to our Homelessness to a Home program, and we said, look, we're really struggling in Bendigo, and again, our CEO, Trudy Ray, was on ABC Radio being interviewed and did a call out. If anyone's got a property that they want to lease us, let us know. And we kind of went around the real estate agents, and we had about a dozen homes with people that came to us independently and said, we've got a home, we were going to use it for this, but we're happy to lease it. On the flip side though, there are some very opportunistic homeowners out there who will say, oh, hang on, so this is Haven Home Safe, you're an agent of government, you must have billions. Oh, your renter, when you shifted out, completely destroyed it. We're going to have to get the whole place repainted, new kitchen. And it's like, yeah, nah, that's not going to happen. Like, we are still, we leased it, we will return it to you in a leasable process, but we've had some interesting legal conversations with owners about how far it should go.
So I suppose I'm also interested if you had the chance to be the policy owner and make the change with the funding, what are some of the critical things that you would say would be the things that you would say would, if you did these 2 or 3 things, it would help significantly change the dial on policy?
So from our perspective, because we've got a range of programs, and I'm looking at it purely through a program sense, if I was in charge of some of the policy, I would be looking at the particular programs. And I think the biggest gap that we have at the moment, I think where head leasing is great for enabling individuals to really reclaim that personal responsibility, I think it's in having better funding supports for young people. I'm going to bang on about that. I'm going to keep coming back to that because that's the big gap. I think at the moment there's a structural issue. When you have a look at, I guess, quick calculation of 25% of New Start allowance, I think is Sweet FA. Yeah. I think is where it lands. We have 25% of New Start, and we go and head lease, and the young person wants to live somewhere for a period of time, yet who's going to pay the gap ongoing? And that's the issue. It's paying the gap between what the renter can contribute. If we're going to make this longer term, what the renter can contribute to, we still have to pay market rates back to the owner. So I think looking at that difference, and I think we need to have a more mature debate around the no reason eviction. In Victoria, we adopted that 2021. The 120-day notice to vacate was removed. You need very specific reasons now to evict if it goes onto a periodical lease beyond it can be 12 months or 18 months. What happens then? If you're approaching the end, then it becomes very difficult. And so the easy option is to say to the client, I'm sorry, we're going to have to finish this lease because we can't get into a situation where we're going to be carrying the lease longer term. And that in some cases, is re-traumatising a cohort who thought that they had a little bit of housing stability. So the funding gap and who's responsible for it would be the policy I'd be looking at.
I mean, I think in New South Wales, and it's not just because my colleagues are here, they have done a fantastic job in rethinking how head leasing works. It's not seen as a sort of one-off program. It's part of the social housing system, and it's got its own policies around that. And that's the reason we've been able to leverage finance into the program, is because we can say, well, we can guarantee you at least 10 years that we will be head leasing these programs from you, these properties from you. Yeah. I would like to see it increased to beyond the 50% threshold it is at the moment. So at the moment, you can only borrow up to the capacity of 50% of your portfolio head lease. I'd like to see that extended in recognition of the fact that it is a permanent part, and then it enables community housing providers to make some of those judgment calls around purchase and finance, because you know that you have that income source coming through in a guaranteed way. So I think we've got it there. It's about increasing those policy frameworks at the moment to encourage that investment and different ways of working.
Brilliant. Oh, I want that. No, I echo that in terms of, I think that's a discussion here in Queensland that we need to kick off and look at. I'd put it really simply, I hate dead money. Yeah. And I like the thought of we can convert some of that into assets within boundaries. I also think part of it is some of programs are great, except when they create boundaries that then can't shift as the marketplace shifts. And I think some more flexibility in that, where you can do different things, and including using top-ups and things like that, gives us more of an opportunity to be able to use it more efficiently at the moment.
At the moment, in the... Yes, down there, yes.
I'd like to hear from the panel, because we manage over 3,500 properties in the private sector. It is not really, we cannot really choose our clients. It is really demand driven. I'd like to hear it from you guys. How do you manage your tenant damage side of the matters, and how do you monitor how the tenant's actually looking after the place?
How do we? So we manage it like a social housing property. So that, I mean, our housing managers are in the properties in the same way. We do the property inspections with the real estate agent and our tenants, and we're often out there. So for example, for our Housing First programs, that's more than once a year, that's every 3 months. So you can pretty well see where things are going off. But I have to say that scale enables you to do something a little bit differently and more cost effectively. And I think that, so you don't get caught up in, sometimes you will have a spectacular failure of a Housing First client in a head lease property. And you have to then bring that property up to standard and do that. But overall, we don't have it's comparable to our social housing dwellings, because it's part of the way that we manage the property. So I think you have to build it into the way that you manage your portfolio as a whole.
And we're the same, exactly the same. There's no difference between the way we manage a head lease property to any of the properties that we own. In fact, dealing with different real estate agents, it's been, I think, an eye-opener on both sides. The sector, the community housing sector, is a lot more advanced than what people think. I'm not talking about just having, I'm talking, preaching to the converted in the room. We don't just have, not every client in our portfolio has these, tremendous trauma-based issues and all the rest of it. They're just people, just trying to live, just trying to get on. But we have a lower ratio than what I've seen in the private rental market. I think tenancy managers there can be anywhere from one tenancy manager to 250 properties. I've heard some cite up to 1 to 300. We do this at 1 to 30. Sometimes 1 to 60. So we'll have one tenancy manager will have no more than 60 in this program, no more than 60 clients. Most of them will only have 30. So you get to know your renter very well. In terms of then, if something does go wrong, you've got a support agency, and of course we have a maintenance budget as well that we will manage it. But it's then incumbent upon us. We get a limited budget for maintenance, so we have to do the right thing and make sure that we put strategies in place to mitigate risk of damage to the property.
Okay.
We do both of those things exactly the same.
Down the front. Yeah.
Property manager.
Oh, hi. On the subject of risk, a really good timing. So my name's Laura. I own and operate a agency in Brisbane. We manage almost 1,500 rentals. So firstly, I'm a really great proponent of head leasing. I've been a promoter of it for quite some time. I think it's a really great idea, and I really love seeing the success that you guys have had. I do want to say, though, that we have had success, but then we have had some failures. Perhaps it was the agency, the company we were dealing with, no one up here. So they didn't turn out very well, and there was no bond. Part of the agreement was no bond. And I thought, well, that's okay because the government's backing this. And so we convinced our landlords, please take this on, 2-year lease, nothing to lose, great. They didn't last 2 years. We had no bond. And basically the company just said, there you go, have your house back. And I do want, nothing to do with you guys, but I just want to say that there's a lot of things that are happening that are not quite what they seem. But my big issue is landlord insurance. Now, in Queensland, I don't know about other states, landlord insurance company regards this as subletting, and subletting is not covered. So in the instance that we had that it all turned to custard, we couldn't even go to the landlord insurer. So I don't know, I'm just throwing a spanner in the works here, but it's a big deal because that's the risk mitigator, to have that landlord insurance in place for loss of rent and damage by tenants. So I just want to see if you guys have had any experience in that. Is that a factor in all of this? And it's a real factor for landlords and for us who are putting our names on the line to encourage landlords to be part of the program.
Look, it definitely is a factor for us. Tremendous example you've given. And look, for us that does happen, and we do have a tenancy that goes to custody, and sometimes it can be an astronomical bill. For us, it is about managing before that happens, I guess, and part of it is we are guaranteeing we will return it into a livable state. So irrespective of, it's not government funding, unfortunately, it's our fund, in terms of where it's coming from, because you're still spreading across that grant and that rental income to do it. But yes, we don't see it as much as we want our landlords to have the insurance, it doesn't mean they can always claim on it.
Yeah.
And we acknowledge that.
Yeah. We haven't had as much of an issue around that because we do underwrite. So we do have cheeky landlords and owners who would like us to do things which are over and above the standard at which the property was let to us. But overall, having seen real estate agents and social housing, I don't think there is any difference between the way that we manage that property versus how it is in the private rental market. You will have spectacular failures in the private rental market as well. I think the thing about a community housing provider is most of the time you're trying to maintain the relationships with the real estate agent. Wherever possible, we try to hold on to the property. So it mightn't work out for that person. They might need to relocate for whatever reason. We try to hold on to that lease to reduce the churn and the turnover and put somebody new in there. And then with those costs in between, we do the work ourselves as part of our own business. So we, I think it's like anything. You will get operators that aren't doing it effectively and you will get ones that do. But we treat that property, if we're holding it for a long time, we will make sure that it's up to standard in between tenancies, and often we don't even have to go back to the real estate agent, we just manage it ourselves. Yeah.
And we're the same.
Yeah.
Kind of feel compelled that I have to apologise on behalf of all community. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think it was a bad
Who was it? Name names. Damn, it's me.
So our relationship would be, we will come in and we will say, we have this client, we don't say the program, could we lease this property? You find a property, we'll give you 6 to 12 months rent up front. And you go, oh, hang on, so your rent's covered? And then we'll say we'll return it at, if there's an issue, we'll return it at a leasable level.
Yep.
We'll still say you need to have, builders need to have builder's insurance. Like if it burns down, like, it's not on us. We'll get it back to lettable, but we're not going to go and rebuild a property if something happened and there was a fire. So don't think that we have deep, deep pockets and we'll do everything, but we'll get it back to you. So sorry. Stick with it though, it's worthwhile.
So we got one down the front there, and then we've got a couple in the front here, I think also so that gentleman down the back.
Hi there, John from Shelter. Just wanted to ask anyone on the panel, I don't know this, and I think I should, and if I don't, others in the room may not. What's the extent to which the lease program applies to affordable housing products as well as social housing?
It doesn't apply to affordable housing in New South Wales.
Trying to do more with the subsidy. Is there an opportunity there for us to be able to, flesh it out a bit and say we could achieve a lot more if we're targeting at the key worker, traditionally discount to market, or less of a subsidy than we provide for social? Is there an opportunity?
It would be less of a subsidy, wouldn't it? Because you're looking at the rent. The reality is, we don't have enough social housing. The 57,000 people on the waiting list in New South Wales. Where's government's effort and investment going? My view is it should be in social housing and the pointier end. These products can apply for social affordable housing because effectively what government is doing is just making up the difference between what the tenant pays and what you're renting it off. So yeah, it would reduce that. But I think that we can focus on more efficient ways of driving efficiency for social housing outcomes before we worry about affordable housing through that program.
Okay, I think we've got lady.
Yeah, hi, Andrea Sharon from RMIT. Now, I'm going to get in trouble with the hurry by speaking about a current project that's not published, so looking at head leasing. And one of the things that we will certainly be recommending is around how to make it a more institutional product and how to aggregate and make it a much more sort of sustainable and broader program. So I think, Rebecca, we should have a conversation.
Yeah.
The other thing that I would like to alert people to, I've put this postcard here. We have a specialist asset management manual for social housing providers. It has a chapter on head leasing. So it sounds like some providers might need a bit of help. And that chapter is going through an update, so I recommend people get a hold of that. But what I'd like to know from you is you've got a subsidy stream, which is largely about the income gap.
Yeah.
What about the make good provisions? We heard from providers who regularly were paying $40,000 in make good because of the particular cohorts they were housing.
Yeah, I think that I haven't heard of $40,000, but so for example, end of tenancy costs under the leasehold program would be about $2,500 across our program, and so. But having said that, they can be spectacular failures as well. But I think that's the scale and the way that we manage that program at Bridge Housing. If you're a smaller provider and you've got a head lease program, it is a higher risk for you because you can't mitigate that in any way. You've only got that money. So I think, yeah, absolutely it has been. And for our Housing First cohort, it's been a much higher program. So under the New South Wales program, technically you have about $800 end of tenancy cost. That's theoretically for your head lease program. But yeah, on average ours is $2,500 end of tenancy cost. So that in no way meets that.
Yep, I would add to that I think we worked ours out recently, and as a smaller provider it does bite at us a lot harder. It is difficult to make it a sustainable program. I think we're 2.7, but that means we've got some big whoppers and some that weren't.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's even down to cash flow and things like that. So it is a complex one to do, and with rising maintenance costs, it's getting more complicated because simple things cost a lot more than they did before.
Yeah.
It's economies of scale. Definitely, we have a pool, so if we've got 150 in a pool, there'll be 2,500. You put it in, may not spend it all. It is amazing what an unsupervised young person
can do
with friends over a long weekend in a high-rise. So
it was you.
It
was him.
Have you been looking at my son?
So we did hit a $40,000 repair bill. It just happens. They're very rare. and you've got to try and have insurance your own to mitigate against that. Institutionally, looking at it, I think this has the capacity to do it at scale. Particularly, I think defence housing do it extremely well, where if we can get people who want to tip their house in and offer to have a 20-year lease model and get it slightly less and cap it so it allows us to reduce that subsidy, so we can hit the supply side and bring down what's being offered, and then we can bring it up and put the right government-sponsored. Sorry, I'm pointing to someone in government. I shouldn't do that, but if we can get that, meet that subsidy, and then it's incumbent upon us. We're the third part. This is a tripartite agreement. If we can then work internally to make sure that we support the renters to mitigate risk against damage, I think it has a potential to be a good market.
Yeah,
not a substitute.
$290 million in New South Wales. Tara outlined 3,500 in public housing head leasing itself. What we're doing, obviously, that partnership with Conscious Investment Management. Housing First in Victoria have a similar sort of program. But yeah, to think about that, aggregating that as a program, I think there's huge potential to do that, because we've already seen that most of the key worker affordable housing models are about hold for a period of time and sell. That's how they cross-subsidise the program. So you'd have to think about that from a programmatic approach, so that you're not getting to the 10 years and everyone's selling up and where are you going. But there's huge potential to do that, I think.
Okay, we've got a call in the front here, and then there's one down the back after that.
Good afternoon. Michael August from DCJ Housing in the Community Housing Branch. Beck, thanks for acknowledging your funding department. But also in terms of the flexibility that has been built into the program. So way back in the distant past, stamps used to be counted in terms of providing money to community housing providers. Now it's block grants.
Yeah.
And the guarantee that you've mentioned, which has led on into the conscious investment, the question is, what savings have you seen in terms of either resources or cash that's come out of that relationship with conscious investment?
Well, nothing at the moment, because we're awaiting approval for SPV from the registrar. It's exactly that. So under the agreement with Conscious Investment Management, we operate in some ways like a real estate agent ourselves, right? But we're head leasing we're managing the properties ourselves. So we're cutting out all of those sorts of administrative issues that we've saved. So we think that we'll save administrative dollars. And at the same time, we're also getting a management fee from Conscious Investment for those properties. So that will be managed through our private real estate, not-for-profit real estate agency to sort of congregate that. And so I think it's more around the administration and saving money in that way, because as you can see, there were 400 different real estate relationships. We have 50 owners, direct relationships. That's very administratively burdensome. So just dealing with one investor with 100 units is much easier, and we know that we've got them for 10 years. So the churn for us is a big issue. As my slide showed, notices of termination, that's the most costly. Wherever possible, we try and hold on to that property for a long time, because the cost is in churning through the program.
Agree.
So we have a little evaluation plan for it, Michael, and I will keep you posted on how much we're saving. But I will say, to John's point, what we have done, so because we have a not-for-profit real estate agency, Homeground, and we've got a tax ruling now through Homeground Real Estate, so that owners can lease their property through us, and if they lease it at below market rent, they then claim that amount as a charitable deduction at the end of the year. So through that program, we've now got 50 different properties that in effect are affordable housing, because they're below market rate. And that's being subsidised through the tax system. It's got nothing to do with the State Housing Authority. It's completely mum and dad investors who want to make a difference through their property. So I think there's some ways that you can look at different things to intervene in the market, and having a focus on real estate and that sort of mentality in terms of how you manage properties and how you think of it, I think you can drive some efficiencies there and create some better housing outcomes, because the states and the Commonwealth aren't contributing to that housing at all. It's just done through mum and dad investors who want to make a difference.
Okay, I think down the back.
Oh, don't ask them. It's my staff. Sorry.
At all.
Yeah, they
I'm
haven't heckled yet. It's going to happen.
No, so we currently have someone full-time working on actually trying to sign up new head leases. However, there is sort of a massive stigma on people in relation to social housing. We are only one company with obviously many other CHPs across Queensland. Is there something more that can be done as a whole to actually increase, I guess, the social housing stigma?
That was a good question.
That's a great question. Do
It is.
you want to answer for your staff?
Yeah. Your promotion's still not happening. All right. They'll try anything.
I think it's having these conversations right now and keeping the conversations going, that there is a stigma and there will always be a stigma. I don't know how long it's going to take to break through that. I think we're all looking at we're putting our responses into the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. I think a key part of that could be we just try and just change the narrative. We need to lift the narrative. Why is it a stigma here but it's not in some Scandinavian countries? We need to get through it. But then I think when we get situations like what was called out by the colleague earlier, that just undermines it for everyone. That sets it back. The relationship management of one bad experience, and in that case I would say it's not even really the renter, it was the agency, it just puts us all back. So I think it's about recognising that we lift and we all step up. We do some amazing things. I think that's not recognised by the sector. We focus on the renters that we're supporting, but we need to also lift and the discussion around how good we are. As a sector, we are really, really good, but we don't promote that. So we kind of go into with the privates and say, oh, could you please help us? And sorry about the stigma. No, apologise. We're making a difference. We've got to continue to make a difference. And we've got to just claim that we are good and own that space and demonstrate it.
I agree. I think we're one of the few sectors that we don't promote ourselves, which is weird because we promote everything else, but we don't promote the good stories. And I know some shelter people are potentially here, and we've had a minister come and talk about, she's from social housing, and there's so many great stories out of social housing. I think it would be a great opportunity to market that, by the way, it does change lives and it makes a difference, and it's a completely different set. Jonathan Thurston's from social housing. Like, there's some great examples as opposed to the horrible story.
I think we need to shift the dial. The reason that there's a stigma is it's a tiny percentage of the housing market. Less than 4% is social housing. And to get into social housing, you have to be the most disadvantaged in society. And we're really limiting who can go into social housing. So for me, it's not a surprise that there's a stigma there, because actually our government's policies have driven that stigma. But I will say the reality is that the majority of people who get Commonwealth rent assistance are on a Centrelink payment and get Commonwealth rent assistance live in the private market. They're social housing residents in all intents and purposes. They're the people we're housing. The majority of them never get to live in social housing. They're just struggling in the private rental market. That's the reality. So I think we need to get back to the reality of who's living in our properties. I think we can market ourselves better, but what we need to do is radically increase the supply of social housing and affordable housing, and as a proportion of the market, so that we can get to places where it's not such a stigma anymore to live in social and affordable housing that's managed by the government or a community housing provider.
Well done.
Good point.
We may have time for one more question, I think.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks to the panel for sharing. Michael Pugh from St Patrick's over in Western Australia, like Haven, but much, much smaller. We're a homelessness organisation that does community housing. Back before COVID, we embarked on a very modest experiment in head leasing connected with Housing First. Then COVID happened and that got really interesting. We did achieve some good outcomes, but one of the challenges in particular for us is that the subsidy available to us from the state government only lasted for 2 years. So I'm quite interested, Rebecca, particularly in your context, how the funding works from your state government.
Yeah, so we're in the same boat. So Together Home, which was the New South Wales government's response to COVID and Housing First and homelessness, that was originally 2 years, and part of the commitment by community housing providers, and there are a number of them from New South Wales in the room today, was that we were to find exit options, i.e. transition into either our mainstream CHLP leasehold program or social housing. So it was time limited. What we've found though, because we've got such a large program, is that we do have the vacancy that enables us to be able to absorb those properties within our portfolio. For smaller providers, you don't. It's a huge risk. I would warn providers that are small not to embark on head leasing programs without really talking to someone that administers it. It is more expensive for you to manage a head lease program, particularly for Housing First clients, than social housing, absolutely. And you don't have anything to manage that risk. Yeah.
Okay, any last burning questions we've got? No? We're done? Okay, well look, thank you very much, panel. I think that for everyone could congratulate them for the hope you might be able to take that back to your organisations and have a think about that and talk to your respective government agencies. No, Therese, you're okay.
Yeah. See you after, mate.
And look, dinner will be available on the lunch. We'll be there, with it. Thank you very much for attending the session, and I hope you have the rest of a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I'm going to be in trouble.
Yeah, no, thanks.